March 19th, 1848. The air in Monmouth, Illinois was freezing, the ground hard as iron when Wyatt Barry Stapp Earp was born. He was the fourth son of Nicholas and Virginia Earp, a child entering a household defined not by warmth but by the rigid, terrifying structure of his father. Nicholas was a veteran of the Mexican-American War, a man who carried the discipline of the cavalry into his domestic life. He demanded absolute obedience, enforcing his will with a heavy hand and a voice that tolerated no dissent. Wyatt learned early that survival meant silence and labor. The family moved constantly, driven by Nicholas's inability to settle, dragging the children from Illinois to Iowa, chasing crop yields that rarely materialized. By the time Wyatt was barely walking, his hands were already being trained to grip tools. His childhood surrendered to the endless cycle of planting and harvesting. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 dismantled the family dynamic. Wyatt was 13 years old, a boy physically but hardened by a decade of farm labor. His older brothers, James, Virgil, and Newton, immediately enlisted to fight for the Union. Wyatt watched them leave, consumed by a fierce, burning jealousy. He saw their uniforms and their rifles as tickets to freedom, a way to escape the crushing monotony of the cornfields and the tyranny of his father. He tried repeatedly to run away, packing meager supplies and heading for the recruitment offices, but Nicholas always caught him. The older man would drag him back to the farm, often beating him for his insolence, forcing him back into the furrows of the 80-acre farm in Pella, Iowa. For 3 years, while the country tore itself apart with cannon fire and bayonets, Wyatt fought a war against weeds, drought, and stubborn mules. He plowed the earth until his muscles screamed, the isolation of the Iowa plains fueling a deep, simmering resentment against authority and confinement. He was the man of the house by default, responsible for the harvest, the livestock, and the protection of his mother and sisters, a burden that aged him prematurely. In 1864, the return of his brothers, battered and weary from the war, did not bring peace. Nicholas Earp decided to move the family again, this time joining a wagon train bound for San Bernardino, California. This 7-month journey was the forge that finally hammered the boy into a man. It was a brutal, slow-moving ordeal across thousands of miles of hostile terrain. Wyatt, now 16, was tasked with hunting to feed the train and guarding the livestock. He carried a rifle daily, learning the ballistics of killing at a distance. He stalked buffalo and antelope, learning to read the wind and the terrain, skills that would later translate to hunting men. The trail was a graveyard of livestock and dreams. He saw oxen collapse from exhaustion, their eyes rolling back as they died in the harness, only to be cut loose and left for the buzzards. He drank water thick with alkali that twisted the gut, and he watched graves being dug in the hard dirt for travelers who succumbed to dysentery or accidents. There was no romance in the migration, only dust, heat, and the stench of animal sweat. Upon arriving in the San Bernardino Valley, Wyatt refused to return to the plow. He had tasted the limited freedom of the trail and sought work that matched his restlessness. He found employment as a teamster, driving massive freight wagons across the scorched deserts between San Bernardino, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake City. This was work for men with calloused souls. He managed teams of 16 mules or horses, wielding a long whip with a precision that could take a fly off a mule's ear or slash the face of a highwayman. The days were long, filled with the grinding noise of iron wheels on rock and the constant threat of ambush. He moved cargo through the Mojave, a landscape that offered no mercy. The heat blistered his skin, turning it the color of cured tobacco. He learned to fight with his fists during the stopovers in rough camps, engaging in bare-knuckle brawls where the only rule was to stay standing. He was tall, 6 feet of lean muscle, and he learned to throw a punch that utilized his entire body weight, breaking noses and jaws with a sickening crunch. He discovered that violence was a language everyone understood and he was fluent in it. By 1868, the family moved again, retracing their steps east to Lamar, Missouri. Wyatt followed, but the wildness of the freight trail had marked him. He attempted to conform to the expectations of society. In 1870, he pinned on a badge for the first time, appointed as the constable of Lamar after his father resigned the post. It was a job of serving warrants, ejecting drunks from saloons, and maintaining a veneer of order. He took the position not out of a sense of civic duty, but for the salary and the status. He was a terrifying physical presence on the streets of Lamar, a man who did not need to draw a weapon to enforce compliance. During this brief window of stability, he courted Urilla Sutherland, the daughter of a local hotelier. She was a grounding force, a woman who seemed to calm the volatility inside him. They married in January of 1870, and Wyatt bought a lot on the edge of town, building a small house with his own hands, driving nails into wood with the hope of a permanent future. The destruction of Wyatt Earp began in late 1870. Urilla became pregnant, and the couple prepared for a family, but an epidemic of disease swept through the region. The disease struck Urilla with devastating speed. Wyatt watched as his young wife, the only person who had ever elicited tenderness from him, disintegrated before his eyes. The fever raged through her, causing her to hallucinate and thrash in the bedsheets. The dehydration was severe, her skin turning papery and gray. There was no medicine to stop it. He sat by her side for days, listening to her labored breathing, wiping the sweat that soaked her hair. When she died, along with their unborn child, the house he had built became a tomb. He buried her in the frozen Missouri ground, and with the last shovelful of dirt, he buried his adherence to the moral code. The grief transformed instantly into a cold, destructive nihilism. He felt that the universe had cheated him, that his attempt at a righteous life had been mocked. He stopped caring about the law he was sworn to uphold. He began drinking heavily, the whiskey fueling a rage that he took out on the citizens of Lamar. He engaged in a brutal fist fight with Urilla's two brothers, a brawl born of their accusations that he had not cared for her properly. He beat them savagely in the street, his knuckles tearing their skin, his own face bloodied but his eyes empty. The town turned against him. Lawsuits were filed accusing him of mishandling public funds and forging court documents to cover his tracks. He had collected license fees and pocketed the cash, viewing it as compensation for his loss. The badge, once a symbol of authority, was now just a piece of metal on a corrupt man's chest. Facing imminent removal from office and likely prosecution, Wyatt fled Lamar in 1871. He did not leave a forwarding address. He drifted south into the Indian Territory, a sprawling, lawless expanse that served as a sanctuary for the worst elements of the frontier. Here, the federal government had little reach, and a man could disappear into the tall grass and the endless horizon. Wyatt fell in with a group of men who lived by theft and intimidation. He met a man named Edward Kennedy, a rough character who saw the large herds of livestock moving through the territory as easy pickings. Wyatt, the former constable, stripped away the last remnants of his legal past and agreed to a felony. The target was a pair of horses belonging to a man named James Keyes. These were not wild mustangs but valuable draft animals, essential for work and transport, worth over $100 each. In the frontier economy, stealing a man's horse was akin to sentencing him to death. It stripped him of his mobility and his livelihood. Wyatt did not care. On a humid night in late March near the banks of the Arkansas River, he and Kennedy, along with Wyatt's brother Morgan, crept toward Keyes' encampment. The ground was soft, muffling their boots. Wyatt moved with the stealth of a predator, his heart hammering against his ribs, not from fear but from the adrenaline of the crime. He cut the tethers with a sharp knife, the leather parting silently. They mounted the stolen animals and rode hard into the darkness, driving the horses north toward Kansas. They covered nearly 50 miles in a single night, pushing the animals to the brink of collapse. Wyatt rode with a grim determination, the wind whipping his face, the stolen horse, beneath him a testament to his new reality. He was an outlaw now, a thief in the night. They believed they had outrun the consequences, that the vastness of the territory would hide their tracks. But James Keyes was a man of resources. He did not accept the theft. He rode to the nearest federal outpost and swore out a complaint. The task of retrieving the animals and the men fell to Deputy United States Marshal J.G. Owens. Owens was a relentless tracker, a man who knew the territory better than the criminals who hid in it. On April 6, 1871, the law caught up with Wyatt Earp. He and his accomplices had stopped to rest, confident in their distance from the crime scene. They were exhausted, their guard down. Marshal Owens and his posse surrounded the camp before dawn. Wyatt woke to the sound of a hammer cocking on a rifle. He looked up to see the barrels of federal weapons leveled at his chest. There was no shootout, no glorious stand. He was dragged from his bedroll, his hands bound tightly behind his back with rough hemp rope. He was stripped of his weapons and his dignity. The ride back to Fort Gibson was a humiliation. Wyatt sat silently in the saddle, his wrists chafing against the rope, staring at the back of the marshal's head. He was 23 years old and he was being hauled in like common livestock. The legal machinery of the United States government began to process him. An indictment was handed down, a formal document that stained his name with a felony charge. The case was titled United States versus Wyatt Earp, Edward Kennedy and John Doe. The charge was larceny in the Indian Territory. The text of the indictment was dry and specific, detailing the theft of the horses and their value, cementing Wyatt's status as a criminal defendant. He was arraigned on April 14th before United States Commissioner James Churchill. The bond was set at $500, a fortune for a man with nothing but the clothes on his back. Wyatt stood before the commissioner, his face a mask of sullen defiance. But inside, the reality of the penitentiary was a cold knot in his stomach. He was transported to the Crawford County Jail in Van Buren, Arkansas, to await trial. The jail was a nightmare of stone and iron. The cell was small, dark, and damp, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and an open waste bucket in the corner. Wyatt was thrown in with other hard men, thieves and killers waiting for the judge or the hangman. He spent his days sitting on a hard wooden bench, staring at the walls, tracing the cracks in the stone. He replayed the events that had led him there, the farm in Iowa, the wagon train, the grave in Lamar, and the stolen horses. He realized that the difference between the constable he had been and the prisoner he was now was merely a matter of circumstance and opportunity. The system did not care about his grief or his history, it only cared that he was caught. Weeks dragged on, his co-defendant Kennedy managed to secure bail and eventually fled, later to be killed. But Wyatt remained rotting in the cell. He knew that if he went to trial, he would be convicted. The evidence was solid and his character witnesses were non-existent. He looked at the heavy door and the barred window, calculating the odds. He began to watch the turnkey, noting the schedule of the rounds, the sound of the heavy keys, and the moments when the guard's attention drifted. He spoke to other prisoners, gathering information on the structure of the roof and the layout of the yard. He was not going to go to prison. He was not going to break rocks for the government. On May 6, 1871, Wyatt Earp executed his escape. The exact method was never officially recorded, lost to the chaos of the time, but the result was undeniable. He exploited a weakness in the jail's upper ventilation, squeezing his large frame through a narrow opening in the roof timber. He dropped into the shadows of the alleyway behind the jail, the impact jarring his ankles. He did not pause. He ran through the darkened streets of Van Buren, his breath tearing at his lungs, the sound of his own heartbeat deafening in his ears. He stole a horse from a nearby hitching post, another crime to add to the list, and kicked the animal into a gallop. He rode north, away from Arkansas, away from the indictment that would remain open for years, away from the grave of his wife. He crossed the state line into Missouri and kept going, aiming for Illinois. He was a fugitive now, a man with a price on his head and a documented history of felony theft. The farm boy who had wanted to be a soldier was gone. The constable who had wanted a family was gone. The man who rode into the night was something else entirely. A survivor who had learned that the law was a trap and that violence was the only reliable tool. He had no badge, no wife, and no home. He had only his hands, his anger, and a burning need to dominate the world that had tried to crush him. He headed for the river town of Peoria, where the vice was heavy and the questions were few. February 1872. The Illinois River moved like a sluggish vein of black oil through the heart of Peoria, carrying with it the stench of raw sewage and the industrial refuse of the distilleries that lined the banks. Wyatt Earp arrived in this river town not as a conqueror, but as a man seeking the darkest corners of civilization to hide his fugitive status. The winter air was thick with the cloying, sweet smell of fermenting corn mash, a scent that hung over the city like a shroud. Peoria was a booming, brawling municipality known far and wide as the whiskey capital of the world, a place where morality was dissolved in high-proof spirits and money was the only god that commanded reverence. The streets near the waterfront were a quagmire of mud and frozen ruts lined with two-story wooden structures that housed saloons on the ground floor and cribs for prostitution above. This was the environment Wyatt chose, a place where a man's past was irrelevant as long as his coin was good and his fists were hard. He drifted immediately into the Tenderloin district, a distinct zone of vice that operated with the tacit approval of the local government, provided the graft was paid on time. Wyatt was 23 years old, physically imposing and entirely stripped of the idealism that had once driven him to pin on a constable's star. He was broke, his clothes worn from the flight from Arkansas, his eyes scanning the crowds for opportunity. He found it in the house of Jane Haspel. She ran a brothel on Washington Street, a notorious establishment that catered to the rougher trade of riverboat men, distillers, and transients. It was not a high-class parlor with piano music and velvet drapes. It was a working house, smelling of cheap perfume, stale tobacco, and sweat. Wyatt did not enter as a customer. He entered as a man looking for a role in the machinery of the underworld. Jane Haspel needed muscle. Her business was cash only and inherently dangerous, attracting men who were drunk, violent, and often armed. She saw in Wyatt Earp a specific kind of utility. He was large, quiet, and possessed a terrifying stillness that unsettled the rowdy patrons. He moved into the brothel, taking a room not as a boarder but as a resident enforcer. In the parlors of Peoria, they had a name for men like him: bummers. It was a derogatory term implying a man who loafed around houses of ill repute, living off the earnings of fallen women, a parasite on the skin of the vice trade. Wyatt accepted the title without protest. It was better than a cell in Arkansas. His daily existence became a nocturnal cycle of violence and intimidation. He slept during the day, the shouts of street vendors and the clatter of wagons filtering through the thin walls of his room. He woke as the sun dipped below the bluffs, dressing in the dark, checking the load in his revolver, though he rarely used it. In Peoria, the weapon of choice was the fist or the blackjack. He would take his post in the main parlor or near the front door, his arms crossed, watching the flow of men with a predator's gaze. When a customer became too aggressive with one of the women or refused to pay or began to break the furniture, Wyatt moved. The violence was never choreographed. It was sudden and brutal. He would grab a man by the collar and the belt, utilizing his immense strength to hurl them through the doors and into the mud of Washington Street. If they resisted, he struck them. He learned the exact amount of force required to drop a man without killing him. A short, chopping blow to the throat or a hard right hand to the temple. The brutality of the work hardened him further. He saw the women of the house not as victims to be saved, but as assets to be protected, their bodies the machinery of the business he now served. He witnessed the grim reality of the sex trade, the disease, the beatings, the desperate alcoholism that many of the women used to numb themselves against the nightly intrusions. Wyatt did not judge, he merely maintained order. He broke up knife fights in the hallway, disarming drunken river rats who slashed at the air with rusted blades. He dragged unconscious men out of the beds and dumped them in the alley, rifling through their pockets for loose change as a tax for the trouble. He was living entirely outside the law, a shadow figure in a world of shadows. On February 24, 1872, the fragile piece of the Tenderloin was shattered by a police raid. The Peoria police force, under pressure from the growing temperance movement and the respectable citizens on the hill, launched a crackdown on the riverfront dives. They kicked in the doors of the Haspel brothel shortly after midnight. The wood splintered and uniformed officers poured into the parlor, batons swinging. Wyatt was caught in the center of the room. He did not run. He knew the drill. This was part of the overhead cost of doing business. He was arrested, handcuffed, and marched out of the house along with Jane Haspel and several of the women. The Peoria Daily Transcript noted the event, listing the names of those swept up in the dragnet. Wyatt Earp was listed prominently, charged with being found in a house of ill fame. The jail in Peoria was overcrowded and loud, a stark contrast to the solitary dread of the Arkansas cell. Here, the holding tank was a social club for the underworld. Wyatt sat on the bench surrounded by pickpockets, drunks, and other bummers. There was no shame in his posture. He treated the arrest as a transactional inconvenience. When he stood before the magistrate the next morning, he did not offer a defense. The judge looked down at the large man with the cold eyes and levied a fine of $20 plus court costs. Wyatt paid the money from a roll of cash he kept in his boot, the earnings of his enforcement work. He walked out of the courthouse and went straight back to Washington Street. The raid changed nothing. It merely cut into the profits for the week. Throughout the spring and summer of 1872, Wyatt's name appeared repeatedly in the police dockets. He was a known entity now, a regular in the cycle of arrest and release. In May, he was picked up again during a raid on a different establishment, a floating brothel anchored in the river known as the Beard. This boat was a wretched hive, a shanty built on a flatboat that drifted just off the shoreline to avoid municipal ordinances, though the police raided it anyway. The conditions on the boat were squalid, the floorboards slick with river slime and spilled whiskey. Wyatt was found there, acting as the protector for the women who worked the cramped rocking cabins. The police hauled everyone to shore. The newspaper accounts were scathing, describing the men found on the boat as the scum of the river. Wyatt Earp was among them, his reputation in Peoria cementing into that of a career criminal and a pimp. The summer brought heat and cholera scares, the stagnant air of the river valley turning the city into a furnace. The violence in the Tenderloin escalated with the temperature. Wyatt found himself in more brawls, his knuckles perpetually swollen or scabbed. He fought a man in the alley behind Haspel's place who tried to pistol whip him. Wyatt blocked the blow, the metal barrel striking his forearm with a dull thud, and retaliated with a savage knee to the groin and a hook that broke the man's nose. The blood sprayed across Wyatt's shirt, a warm, metallic reminder of his station in life. He left the man moaning in the garbage and went back inside to finish his drink. There was no glory in these fights, no honor to be defended. It was simply the maintenance of territory. By September of 1872, the scrutiny on Wyatt intensified. The authorities were growing tired of the constant presence of the bummers. They began to target the men, specifically charging them with vagrancy if they could not prove a legitimate means of employment. Wyatt, of course, had no legitimate job. His income was entirely derived from the illegal earnings of the brothel. To counter this, he briefly took on the guise of a professional gambler sitting at the faro tables in the saloons, dealing cards with a practiced hand. He had learned the tricks of the trade during his time in the freight camps. How to palm a card, how to read a mark, how to manipulate the odds. But even this was a thin veil. The police knew who he was and what he did. In November, another raid struck the Haspel house. This time, the police were more aggressive. They dragged Wyatt out of a back room where he had been sleeping. The charge was once again keeping and being found in a house of ill fame. The fine was heavier this time, $44. The judge warned him that the next time would mean the workhouse. Wyatt paid the fine, but the warning registered. The vice was tightening. Peoria was becoming less hospitable to his kind. The town was trying to clean up its image, to pave the streets and light the lamps, and men like Wyatt Earp were the dirt they wanted to sweep away. The winter of 1873 was harsh. The river froze solid, halting the steamboat traffic and choking off the flow of fresh money into the vice district. The brothels grew quiet, the desperation of the women more palpable. Wyatt spent long hours staring into the wood stove, the cold seeping through the walls. He began to feel the itch of restlessness again, the same urge that had driven him from the cornfields. He was stagnating. He was 25 years old, and his life was a sordid loop of brawls, arrests, and cheap whiskey. He looked at the older bummers in the district, men with broken faces and gin-blossom noses, and saw his future. It was a repulsive vision. Despite the stagnation, he remained in Peoria through 1873, entrenched in the lifestyle. He formed loose alliances with other peripheral figures of the underworld, men who would later drift west with him. He learned the value of a reputation for menace. In a town of hard men, Wyatt established himself as one of the hardest. He never blustered or bragged. He simply acted. When a patron drew a knife in the parlor one humid July night, threatening to cut a woman who had laughed at him, Wyatt walked up to him with his hands down. The man lunged. Wyatt sidestepped, caught the man's wrist and twisted it until the bone snapped with a sound like a dry branch breaking. The knife clattered to the floor. Wyatt dragged the screaming man to the door and threw him into the street. The efficiency of the violence was his trademark. In 1874, the political climate in Peoria shifted decisively. A new administration came into power with a mandate to purge the social evil. The raids became nightly occurrences. The fines were replaced with jail sentences. The police began to beat the bummers in the cells, sending a clear message. Get out or get broken. Wyatt watched as his associates were rounded up and sent to the stone quarry to work off their sentences. The Haspel brothel was targeted relentlessly, the doors padlocked, the windows boarded up. The easy money was gone. The ecosystem that had supported him was collapsing under the weight of reform. Wyatt sat in a saloon on Water Street in late summer of 1874, nursing a beer. The room was empty save for a few flies buzzing over a spill on the bar. He took stock of his situation. He had a criminal record in 2 states now. He was a fugitive horse thief in Arkansas and a documented pimp in Illinois. He had no trade, no land, and no wife. He was a parasite on a dying host. The West was calling again. He heard stories from the cattle drovers who came up the river, stories of the boom towns in Kansas, places like Wichita and Ellsworth, where the Texas cattle herds arrived by the hundreds of thousands. They said those towns were wild, awash in money and violence, places where a man with a steady hand and a lack of scruples could find a new foothold. He decided to leave. He did not say goodbye to Jane Haspel or the women he had protected. There was no sentimentality in their relationship. It was a business arrangement that had reached its expiration date. He packed his meager belongings, a change of clothes, his revolver, a deck of cards, into a canvas sack. He walked out of the boarding house for the last time, stepping over the frozen ruts of the street. He headed for the train station, buying a ticket west with the last of his illicit earnings. As the train pulled out of Peoria, chugging past the smoking chimneys of the distilleries and the gray expanse of the river, Wyatt felt a strange sense of clarity. The Peoria chapter of his life was closed. It had been a dirty, shameful interlude, a descent into the gutter, but it had taught him valuable lessons. He had learned how the criminal mind worked because he had lived as one. He knew how to spot a cheat, how to anticipate a sucker punch, and how to intimidate a man without saying a word. He knew the smell of fear and the look of a man who was ready to kill. He was leaving Peoria not as a reformed man, but as a more dangerous one. He had seen the bottom and he had survived it. Now he was going to Kansas, to the cattle towns where the law was thin and the chaos was thick. He was done being a bummer. He was ready to be something else, something that required the very hardness he had cultivated in the brothels of the Illinois River. September 1874. The train rattled across the plains, the landscape opening up into the vast, treeless horizon of the west. Wyatt watched the miles roll by, his reflection in the glass ghostly and grim. He was leaving the river damp behind for the dry wind of the high plains. He carried the stain of Peoria with him, a layer of grime that would never fully wash off. But he also carried a set of skills that would soon make him famous. The horse thief and the pimp was fading. The gunman was beginning to emerge. He checked the cylinder of his revolver, spinning it with a click, and closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of the wheels on the iron rails, a cadence that sounded like a countdown to the violence waiting for him in Wichita, April 21st, 1875. The wind coming off the Arkansas River in Wichita, Kansas, carried the heavy, pungent scent of bovine waste and unwashed men. Wyatt Earp stood on Douglas Avenue, the main artery of a town that was rapidly transforming from a trading post into a sprawling marketplace of flesh and beef. He was 27 years old now, his face leaner, the jawline set with a permanent rigidity that suggested a man who expected trouble and was prepared to meet it with overwhelming force. He had left the grimy river bottoms of Peoria behind, trading the role of the brothel enforcer for a position that offered a veneer of legitimacy. Though the work remained largely the same, he had been hired by the Wichita police force as an officer, a title that bestowed upon him a metal star and the legal right to inflict pain. The transition was seamless. In Peoria, he had managed vice for the profit of a madam. In Wichita, he would manage violence for the profit of the city council, keeping the peace just enough so that the Texas drovers could spend their wages on whiskey and women without burning the town to the ground. Wichita in the spring was a cacophony of commerce and chaos. The Chisholm Trail ended here, funneling hundreds of thousands of longhorn cattle into the pens near the railroad tracks. With the cattle came the cowboys, men who had spent months in the saddle, eating dust and sleeping on the hard ground. They arrived in town with pockets full of pay and a desperate hunger for release. They were young, wild, and heavily armed, viewing the townspeople not as hosts, but as targets for their amusement. The city statutes prohibited the carrying of firearms within the town limits, a rule that was universally despised by the Texans and required a specific type of man to enforce. Wyatt Earp was that man. He did not look like a peace officer in the traditional sense. He wore a black frock coat, a white shirt that gathered dust within an hour of putting it on, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his eyes. He did not swagger. He walked with a deliberate, heavy gait, his eyes scanning the verandas and the saloon doors, looking for the telltale flash of metal or the sudden rise in voices that signaled a brawl. The brutality of his policing style became apparent immediately. Wyatt did not rely on the authority of the law to gain compliance. He relied on the threat of immediate physical trauma. When a drunken cowboy refused to surrender his revolver, Wyatt did not argue or cite the ordinance. He stepped in close, invading the man's personal space with a terrifying speed, and lashed out with the barrel of his own Colt. This technique, known on the frontier as buffaloing, was a calculated strike designed to end a confrontation instantly. The heavy steel barrel, striking the skull just above the ear or across the bridge of the nose, would drop a man as if he had been poleaxed. Wyatt became an expert at this. He could crack a man's head open with a single motion, leaving him unconscious in the dirt to be dragged away to the calaboose. It was efficient, bloody, and entirely necessary in a town where every third man was carrying a skinning knife or a six-shooter. The environment of Wichita was one of constant sensory assault. The streets were broad rivers of mud, churned into a paste by the hooves of horses and the wheels of supply wagons. The air vibrated with the sound of pianos clattering from the saloons, the shouting of barkers promoting keno games, and the lowing of cattle in the distance. Flies were everywhere, swarming over the piles of manure and the spilled beer on the boardwalks. Wyatt moved through this filth with a detached professionalism. He was not a moralizer. He did not care if the cowboys gambled their wages away or visited the brothels in the segregated district known as Delano across the river. His mandate was simple. Keep the violence contained, keep the money flowing, and ensure that the respectable citizens on the north side of town did not have to witness the savagery of the night. He collected fines, broke up fistfights, and dragged limp bodies to the jail, his hands often stained with the blood of the men he had subdued. During the daylight hours, when the town was relatively quiet, Wyatt indulged in the very vices he policed at night. He was a regular at the faro tables, sitting with the professional gamblers who drifted through the cow towns. He played with a cold concentration, his face a mask that revealed nothing of his hand. He understood the mathematics of the game and the psychology of the bluff. Gambling was not just a pastime. It was a way to supplement his income, which was often sporadic and dependent on the collection of bounties and fees. He sat in the smoke-filled rooms, the air thick with tobacco and the smell of nervous sweat, watching the cards turn, his revolver always within easy reach. He was building a network of associates, men who lived on the edge of the law, establishing a reputation as a man who was dangerous to cross but reliable to have on your side. The political landscape of Wichita was as treacherous as the streets. The town was divided into factions, each vying for control of the lucrative cattle trade and the vice districts that serviced it. Marshal Mike Meager was Wyatt's superior and patron, a man who believed in tough policing and the regulation of the saloons rather than their prohibition. Opposing him was a faction led by Bill Smith, a former city marshal who ran a rival political machine and advocated for a different distribution of the graft. The tension between the two groups escalated throughout 1875 and into the spring of 1876 as the city elections approached. Wyatt, loyal to the man who paid him, became a visible symbol of the Meager administration's heavy-handed tactics. He was not a diplomat, he was a bludgeon used by the marshal to intimidate the opposition. The conflict came to a head on Sunday, April 2nd, 1876. The election was imminent, and the rhetoric in the saloons had turned poisonous. Bill Smith was overheard making disparaging remarks about the Meager brothers, accusing them of corruption and nepotism. Word of the insults reached Wyatt, who viewed an attack on Meager as an attack on his own position. The loyalty he felt was tribal. In the chaotic world of the frontier, a man stood by his faction or he stood alone. Wyatt hunted Smith down, finding him in a hallway near the Opera House. The confrontation was not a formal duel. It was an explosion of pent-up aggression. Wyatt cornered Smith, his voice low and menacing. He demanded a retraction, but Smith, emboldened by his own supporters, sneered at the deputy. Wyatt did not hesitate. He struck Smith with his fist, a blow that carried all the weight of his shoulder. Smith staggered back, colliding with the wall. Wyatt moved in, his fists working like pistons, hammering Smith's face and body. The violence was ugly and personal. It was not an arrest. It was a beating. Smith went down, blood pouring from his nose and mouth, his attempts to defend himself futile against the onslaught. Wyatt stood over him, breathing hard, his knuckles split, the rage radiating off him in waves. He dared Smith to get up, dared him to reach for a weapon, but the politician stayed on the floor, broken and humiliated. The assault on a candidate for city marshal could not be ignored. The repercussions were swift. Marshal Meager, forced to uphold the appearance of order, was compelled to arrest his own deputy. Wyatt was charged with violation of the peace and assault. He stood before the police judge, the same magistrate who had processed the hundreds of cowboys Wyatt had dragged in over the previous year. The irony was palpable. The enforcer of the law was now the defendant again. The judge fined him $30 in costs, a significant sum, and relieved him of his duties. The city council, sensing the shifting political winds and eager to distance themselves from the controversy, voted to withhold his final pay. The local newspapers, particularly the Wichita City Eagle, turned on him. They described the incident with glee, painting Wyatt as a thug and a brawler who had disgraced the badge. Reports surfaced hinting at nepotism and the hiring of family members as vagrants, further tarnishing his name. The phrase, "the Bessie Earp incident," was whispered, referring to a brothel madam who claimed relation to the family, adding a layer of scandal to the violence. Wyatt realized that his time in Wichita was finished. The town that had paid him to break skulls now viewed him as a liability. He had served his purpose. The cattle season was ending and the dirty work was done. He was expendable. Wyatt did not wait to be run out of town. He packed his belongings, his face grim. The rejection stung his pride, but it did not break his resolve. He knew that there were other towns on the frontier, places where the railroad was just arriving and the need for men like him was desperate. He looked west, toward the rising star of the cattle trade, Dodge City. It was a place with a reputation even darker than Wichita, a settlement sitting on the edge of the true wilderness, known as the bibulous Babylon of the frontier. It was a place where the law was a rumor and the gun was the only judge. He arrived in Dodge City in May of 1876. The town sat on the north bank of the Arkansas River, a collection of false-fronted buildings and canvas tents baking under the relentless Kansas sun. If Wichita had been rough, Dodge was feral. The buffalo hunters used it as a base of operations, stacking hides in stinking mounds near the tracks. The stench of rotting flesh mixed with the dust, creating an atmosphere of decay and death. The population was a volatile mix of hunters, railroad workers, gamblers, and the first waves of Texas drovers pushing the herds up the western trail. Gunfire was a common sound, ringing out day and night as men settled disputes or simply fired at the moon in drunken exuberance. Wyatt sought out the law enforcement apparatus of the town. The marshal was Larry Dager, a large, rotund man who was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the disorder. Dager needed men who were not afraid to walk into a saloon where 50 armed men were drinking and tell them to quiet down. He looked at Wyatt Earp, tall, quiet, with the cold eyes of a killer and the bruised knuckles of a brawler, and saw exactly what he needed. Wyatt was appointed as an assistant marshal, pinning on a new badge. The pay was decent. $75 a month plus a fee for every arrest. It was a mercenary arrangement. Wyatt was selling his capacity for violence to the highest bidder. His first weeks in Dodge were a trial by fire. The cowboys here were harder, the buffalo hunters more savage. These were men who killed for a living, skinning animals or fighting Comanches, and they did not respect a piece of metal on a vest. Wyatt had to establish his dominance quickly. He patrolled Front Street, the dividing line between the respectable businesses and the chaotic South Side. He walked the boardwalks with a shotgun cradled in his arm, a visual deterrent that spoke louder than any warning. When a group of hunters began shooting out the lamps in a dance hall, Wyatt entered the room alone. The air was thick with smoke and the sharp smell of black powder. He walked straight to the ringleader, a bearded giant smelling of old blood and grease. The man turned, raising his pistol. Wyatt swung the shotgun barrel, smashing it into the man's collarbone. The bone snapped with a wet crunch. The man screamed and dropped his weapon. Wyatt racked the slide of the shotgun, the metallic clack-clack silencing the room. He ordered the rest of the group to drop their guns or be cut in half. They complied. The brutality of the act established his reputation in Dodge instantly. He was not a man to be trifled with. He was calm in the face of fury, precise in his application of force. He did not yell. He acted. The citizens of Dodge, huddled in their stores and homes, whispered his name with a mixture about relief and fear. They had hired a wolf to guard the sheep, but they could not deny that the wolf was effective. Wyatt enforced the dead line, a boundary that separated the north side of town from the south. Anyone crossing to the north side had to surrender their weapons. Enforcement of this rule was a daily struggle, a constant sequence of disarming angry, drunken men who felt naked without their irons. Wyatt collected a mountain of confiscated revolvers, piling them in the marshal's office like cords of wood. July 1876. The summer heat in Dodge was oppressive, the temperature routinely climbing over 100 degrees. The dust was ankle-deep, coating everything in a fine gray powder. Wyatt stood on the corner of 2nd Avenue and Front Street watching a herd of Texas longhorns move through the outskirts of town. The ground trembled with the weight of the animals. The noise was deafening. The bawling of the cattle, the cracking of whips, the shouts of the drovers. Wyatt wiped the sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. He was no longer the farm boy from Illinois or the bummer from Peoria. He was a force of nature in his own right, a fixture of the frontier landscape. He had learned to navigate the complex social hierarchy of the town. He knew which saloon owners paid their taxes and which ones needed a reminder. He knew which gamblers were honest and which ones used marked decks. He moved through the world of the Alhambra Saloon and the Long Branch, nodding to the dealers and the bartenders, a silent observer of the nightly pageant of vice. He understood that his power derived not from the law itself, but from his willingness to go further than the men he policed. If they pushed, he pushed back harder. If they drew a knife, he used a gun barrel. If they drew a gun, he was prepared to kill, though he had not yet had to take a human life in the line of duty. That threshold was approaching, hovering on the horizon like a summer storm. The isolation of the job was profound. Wyatt had few friends, only associates. He kept his own counsel, trusting no one fully. He saw the way the town leaders looked at him as a necessary evil, a tool to be used and then discarded when civilization finally took hold. He accepted this transaction. He did not seek their love. He sought their money and their fear. He was saving his earnings, looking for an angle, a way to rise above the grime of the street. He speculated on mining claims, bought and sold horses, and continued to gamble. He was building a nest egg, always planning for the next move, the next boomtown, the next opportunity. By the end of July, Wyatt Earp was firmly entrenched as a premier lawman of the Kansas frontier. He had tamed the streets of Wichita and was now breaking the spine of the disorder in Dodge. But the violence was taking its toll. The constant vigilance, The adrenaline dumps, the physical trauma of the brawls. It was wearing down his humanity, stripping away the softness and leaving only the hard, calcified core. He was becoming a legend, but the cost was his soul. He walked the dusty streets of Dodge City, a solitary figure in a black coat, waiting for the sun to go down and the madness to begin again. The shadows were lengthening, and in the darkness of the saloons, the next challenge was already drinking itself into a rage, waiting for him to step through the Batwing doors. May 1876. The arrival of the cattle season in Dodge City brought a tidal wave of livestock and humanity that threatened to wash away the fragile infrastructure of the settlement. Wyatt Earp stood on the wooden boardwalk of Front Street, watching the dust rise in choking clouds as thousands of Texas Longhorns were driven into the holding pens near the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe railroad tracks. The noise was a physical weight, the ceaseless bawling of the animals, the cracking of bullwhips that sounded like pistol shots, and the profane shouting of the drovers who had spent months on the trail and were now ready to dismantle the town. Wyatt was now fully entrenched as a guardian of this chaos, a man whose reputation had preceded him from Wichita. He wore the badge of an assistant marshal, but his authority did not stem from the metal star pinned to his vest. It came from the terrifying stillness he maintained in the center of the bedlam. He had ceased to be merely a brawler. He was evolving into a tactician of frontier violence, a man who understood that a single decisive act of brutality could prevent a massacre. The summer of 1876 tested the limits of the Dodge City police force. The cowboys arriving from the South were hardened men, veterans of the Civil War or the Indian Wars, and they resented the imposition of Northern law. They viewed the town as a playground, and the lawmen as nuisances to be ignored or eliminated. Wyatt patrolled the dead line, the railroad tracks that separated the respectable north side from the vice-ridden south side. He enforced the ordinance against carrying firearms north of the tracks with a rigid intolerance. When a cowboy crossed the line with a pistol on his hip, Wyatt did not ask for it politely. He took it. If the man resisted, Wyatt utilized the long barrel of his Colt revolver as an extension of his arm, striking with a calculated force that shattered bone and consciousness. The jails, filled with men nursing broken noses and concussions, living testaments to the Earp method of peacekeeping. As the winter of 1877 approached, the cattle trade slowed and the town exhaled. The violence became less frequent but more desperate, driven by the cold and the boredom of the lingering transients. It was during this lull that Wyatt received a commission that would alter the trajectory of his life. The mayor of Dodge, James "Dog" Kelly, along with the U.S. Marshal's office, tasked Wyatt with tracking down a gang of train robbers led by a man named Dave Rudabaugh. Rudabaugh was a brazen outlaw who had robbed a Santa Fe construction camp and fled south toward Texas. Wyatt accepted the warrant. It was a chance to escape the monotony of the town patrol and to operate on a larger stage. He saddled his horse, packed his saddlebags with ammunition and dried beef, and rode south, crossing the frozen expanse of the Indian Territory. The pursuit of Rudabaugh was a grueling 400-mile trek that tested Wyatt's endurance. He followed cold tracks through a desolate landscape, relying on information from stage drivers and frantic telegraph operators. The trail led him deep into Texas to a wretched outpost known as Fort Griffin. Fort Griffin was a buffalo hunter's town, a place of immense slaughter where the hides of millions of animals were stacked in stinking piles and the ground was slick with grease and blood. It was a haven for fugitives, a place where a man could disappear into the swarm of skinners and gamblers. Wyatt arrived in January of 1878, weary and road-stained, seeking information on his quarry. He entered the Beehive Saloon, a rough establishment owned by John Shancy. The air inside was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. Wyatt approached the bar and asked Shancy if he had seen Rudabaugh. The saloon keeper nodded toward a table in the back corner. He told Wyatt that the man he needed to talk to was not the outlaw, but a gambler who knew everyone and everything in the territory. Wyatt turned to look. Sitting alone at a faro table was a man who looked like a corpse that had forgotten to lie down. He was gaunt, his skin the color of old parchment, his frame wasted by consumption. He was dressed immaculately in a gray suit, a stark contrast to the rough canvas and leather of the buffalo hunters surrounding him. This was John Henry Holliday, known to the frontier as Doc. Wyatt walked to the table. Holliday looked up, his eyes bright with fever and a dangerous intelligence. He coughed, a wet rattling sound that seemed to tear at his lungs, and brought a handkerchief to his lips. When he pulled it away, Wyatt saw the bright flecks of arterial blood. Despite the frailty, there was a lethal aura around the dentist. He carried a nickel-plated revolver and a knife in a breast pocket, and his hands, though thin, moved with the fluid grace of a magician. Wyatt introduced himself and asked about Rudabaugh. Holliday, who held a deep contempt for the outlaw class despite living among them, appreciated the directness of the lawman. He told Wyatt that Rudabaugh had doubled back to Kansas. The information was precise and delivered with a dry, aristocratic wit. In that smoky saloon, amidst the stench of the buffalo trade, a bond was formed. It was an unlikely alliance between the stoic, healthy lawman and the dying, volatile gambler. A friendship forged in the recognition of a shared capacity for violence. Wyatt rode back to Kansas, missing Rudabaugh but carrying the knowledge of a new ally. He returned to Dodge City in May of 1878 to find the town in mourning. His brother-in-arms, City Marshal Ed Masterson, had been murdered in the street. Ed was the older brother of Bat Masterson, a genial and well-liked man who believed in the inherent goodness of people. He had tried to disarm a drunk cowboy named Jack Wagner without violence, relying on persuasion. Wagner had responded by shooting Ed in the abdomen at point-blank range. Ed managed to return fire before collapsing, but the wound was fatal. He died in agony, his intestines perforated. The death of Ed Masterson hardened Wyatt's heart into stone. He viewed Ed's death not as a tragedy of fate, but as a failure of tactics. Ed had been too soft. He had hesitated. Wyatt swore that he would never make the same mistake. He pinned his badge back on with a renewed coldness. The town council, shaken by the murder of their marshal, appointed Wyatt as the assistant marshal again, paying him $75 a month to ensure that the streets were purged of the element that had killed Masterson. The summer of 1878 became a season of iron-fisted rule. Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson, now the county sheriff, operated as a paramilitary force. They did not negotiate. They dominated. On July 26, 1878, the tension in Dodge erupted in an incident that would cement Wyatt's legend as a gunman. The Comique Theater was a popular vaudeville house on Front Street, offering comedy acts and music to the weary drovers. On this particular night, the comedian Eddie Foy was on stage, performing his routine to a packed house. Wyatt was in the audience, relaxing in the stifling heat, believing the night to be quiet. Outside, a group of Texas cowboys, led by a young drover named George Hoyt, rode past the theater. Hoyt had been nursing a grudge against Earp, fueled by a mixture of alcohol and the bravado of his peers. Some rumors claimed a bounty had been placed on Earp's head by rival cattle barons, and Hoyt intended to collect. As Hoyt rode by the open side of the theater, he drew his revolver and fired 3 shots indiscriminately into the building. The bullets tore through the thin wood and whistled over the heads of the audience. Eddie Foy threw himself to the floorboards as the crowd screamed and scrambled for cover. Wyatt did not dive. He moved with the predatory instinct that had kept him alive in Peoria and Wichita. He was out of his seat and through the door before the echo of the shots had faded. He burst onto the boardwalk, his Colt already in his hand. The street was dark, illuminated only by the faint light spilling from the saloon windows. Hoyt and his companions were galloping away, their horses kicking up dust as they headed south toward the bridge that crossed the Arkansas River. They were nearly 70 yards away, a difficult shot for a handgun in poor light. Wyatt did not hesitate. He raised his weapon, extending his arm fully and sighted on the retreating silhouette of George Hoyt. He fired. The heavy-caliber slug bridged the distance in a fraction of a second. It struck Hoyt in the arm, shattering the bone, and continued into his side, punching through his ribs. Hoyt slumped forward in the saddle, crying out as he fell from his horse into the dirt of the street. Wyatt and Bat Masterson ran to the fallen man. Hoyt was groaning, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The bullet had done massive internal damage. They carried him to a doctor, but medicine on the frontier was primitive. The wound festered. Gangrene set in, turning the flesh black and filling the room with the smell of rotting meat. Hoyt lingered in agony for nearly a month, his body slowly succumbing to the infection. He died on August 21, 1878. His death sent a shockwave through the cattle camps. Wyatt Earp had not just buffaloed a drunk. He had shot a man off a galloping horse in the dark. The buntline special myth began to grow. The idea that Earp carried a weapon with an extra-long barrel that allowed him to shoot with rifle-like accuracy. Whether the gun existed as described or was simply a standard Colt used with exceptional skill, the result was the same. Wyatt Earp was a killer. The violence did not cease with Hoyt's death. In October of 1878, another tragedy struck, one that showcased the collateral damage of the gun culture. James Spike Kennedy, the entitled son of a wealthy Texas cattle baron, had been ejected from town by Mayor Dog Kelly for disorderly conduct. Kennedy stewed in his humiliation and rode back into Dodge at 4 in the morning on October 4th, intent on assassination. He rode to the mayor's small frame house, leveled his pistol at the bedroom window, and fired 2 shots through the glass, intending to kill Kelly in his sleep. But Kelly was not in the bed. He was absent, and the room was occupied by a popular variety show singer named Dora Hand. The first bullet passed through the bedding and struck Dora in the right side under her arm. It severed her aorta and killed her instantly. She never woke up. The murder of Dora Hand, a woman known for her charity and kindness, enraged the town. A posse was immediately formed, consisting of the most dangerous men in Dodge: Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, Charlie Bassett, and Bill Tillman. They were heavily armed and fueled by a cold fury. They rode out in pursuit of Kennedy, who was racing toward the safety of his father's ranch in Texas. The posse tracked Kennedy relentlessly, pushing their horses to the breaking point. They caught up with him near a location known as Sowbelly Creek. Kennedy saw them coming and spurred his horse, trying to outrun the lawman. Masterson and Earp did not call for a surrender. Masterson raised his rifle and fired at Kennedy's horse, killing the animal instantly. As the horse went down, Wyatt fired a blast from a shotgun. The buckshot tore into Kennedy's left arm, shattering the elbow and shredding the muscle. Kennedy crashed to the ground, pinned under his dead mount, screaming in pain. The posse surrounded him, guns drawn. Kennedy looked up at them, his arm a ruin of blood and bone, and asked if they had killed him. Wyatt looked down at the whimpering killer and told him that he had killed a woman, not the mayor. The realization broke Kennedy. They hauled him back to Dodge in a wagon, his arm eventually requiring surgery to remove several inches of bone. He survived, and his father's money eventually bought his freedom. But the message had been delivered. The Earps and Mastersons were the apex predators of the plains. Throughout the winter of 1878 and into the spring of 1879, the atmosphere in Dodge began to shift. The town was growing up. The wild days of the cattle drive were beginning to wane as the quarantine lines for Texas cattle moved further west due to splenic fever. The business owners and the new class of settlers wanted stability, not the constant warfare of the saloons. They began to view the Dodge City gang, the clique of lawmen and gamblers that included Earp, Masterson, and Holliday, as an impediment to progress. The very men who had tamed the town were now seen as too rough, too violent, and too corrupt for a civilized municipality. Wyatt sensed the change. He was bored. The salary of a lawman was stagnant, and the opportunities for gambling were drying up as the high rollers moved on. He was 31 years old, and he had nothing to show for his years of service but a reputation and a few scars. He wanted money. He wanted to be the man who owned the town, not the man who patrolled it. In the summer of 1879, letters began to arrive from his brother Virgil, who was in Prescott, Arizona territory. Virgil wrote of a new strike in the San Pedro Valley, a place called Tombstone. He spoke of silver veins as thick as a man's arm, of a boomtown rising from the desert that promised wealth beyond anything they had seen in Kansas. Wyatt's eyes turned southwest. He began to liquidate his assets in Dodge. He resigned his position as assistant marshal on September 9, 1879. The local paper, the Dodge City Ford County Globe, noted his departure with a mix of respect and relief, stating that his record was unblemished and his courage unquestioned. But Wyatt did not care about the accolades of the press. He cared about the silver. He gathered his common-law wife, Mattie Blaylock, a former prostitute he had met during his time in Dodge. She was dependent on laudanum and fiercely loyal, a shadow that followed him. They loaded a wagon with their possessions. His brother Jim and his wife Bessie joined them. The caravan prepared to move. Before he left, Wyatt sent word to Las Vegas, New Mexico, where Doc Holliday had set up a dental practice and a faro bank. He told Doc about the silver in Arizona. He told him that the Earps were moving and that there was room for a friend. Doc, coughing in the high desert air, packed his instruments and his guns. The cast was assembling. As Wyatt rode out of Dodge City in September 1879, he looked back at the town one last time. It was a place of wood and dust, a place where he had killed George Hoyt and hunted down Spike Kennedy. It was the place where he had become Wyatt Earp, the name that now carried weight across the territories. But it was just a way station. The badge had made him famous in Kansas, but the desert of Arizona was waiting to test him. The buntline era was over. The era of the vendetta was about to begin. The wagon wheels creaked as they hit the open prairie, rolling toward the sunset and the bloody destiny that awaited them in a canyon of silver. December 1st, 1879. The wagon wheels ground to a halt in the high desert of the Arizona territory, kicking up a cloud of alkaline dust that coated the throats of the passengers. Wyatt Earp sat on the bench seat, looking out over the sprawling collection of canvas tents and raw lumber that constituted the mining camp of Tombstone. The air was thin and cold, carrying the sharp scent of sagebrush and the metallic tang of crushed rock. He had arrived with his brothers Virgil and James, along with their wives, drawn by the reports of silver strikes that promised to eclipse the wealth of the Comstock lode. The town sat on a mesa between the Dragoon and Whetstone Mountains, a desolate, wind-scoured location that seemed hostile to human life. Yet thousands of men were pouring in, driven by the singular madness of the boom. Wyatt stepped down from the wagon, his boots sinking into the loose soil of Allen Street. He was 31 years old, a man with a formidable reputation. In Kansas, but here, he was just another face in the crowd of prospectors, gamblers, and speculators. He had no badge on his chest. He had come to make money, not to enforce the law. The economy of Tombstone was fueled by silver bullion and whiskey. The mines, the tough nut, the contention, the Grand Central, were pulling millions of dollars from the earth, and that wealth flowed directly into the saloons and gambling halls that lined the main thoroughfares. Wyatt, leveraging his experience from Dodge City, immediately sought a position in the gaming sector. He did not want to dig holes in the ground. He wanted to control the flow of currency that passed over the green felt tables. He secured a quarter interest in the Faro Bank at the Oriental Saloon, a high-class establishment that served as the social hub for the town's elite. The Oriental was a cavernous space filled with the smoke of expensive cigars and the clatter of ivory chips. Wyatt took his place behind the layout, dealing cards with the same cold precision he had used to buffalo drunks in Wichita. The money was good, far better than a lawman's salary. He was earning hundreds of dollars a week, filling his pockets with gold double eagles and silver dollars. For a brief period, it seemed that the Earp brothers had found their paradise in the desert. However, the vacuum of authority in the territory was absolute. Tombstone was isolated miles from the county seat in Tucson, and the surrounding countryside was dominated by a loose confederation of outlaws known simply as the Cowboys. These men were not the hard-working drovers of the Kansas cattle trails. They were rustlers, smugglers, and thieves who operated a massive criminal enterprise across the Mexican border. They stole cattle in Sonora, drove them north to sell to the hungry miners in Tombstone, and then stole horses in Arizona to sell back in Mexico. They wore red sashes around their waists as a badge of their affiliation and rode with a reckless arrogance, believing themselves to be the true lords of the territory. The Earp brothers, with their northern backgrounds, Union sympathies, and rigid adherence to town ordinances, represented a direct threat to this way of life. The friction began almost immediately. The first significant collision occurred in July of 1880. A lieutenant from the Army post at Camp Rucker arrived in town seeking stolen government mules. He enlisted the help of Virgil Earp, who had been appointed as a deputy U.S. Marshal for the region. Wyatt and his younger brother Morgan tagged along. They tracked the mules to the McClory Ranch, a stronghold of the cowboy faction located in the Sulphur Springs Valley. Frank and Tom McClory were wealthy cattlemen who fenced stolen stock for the rustlers. The confrontation at the ranch was tense. The McClorys laughed at the Lawman, openly mocking their authority and refusing to return the animals. The soldiers eventually backed down to avoid a firefight, but the Earps did not forget the insult. The lines were drawn. On one side stood the Earps and the town's business class. On the other stood the cowboys and the rural element that despised city ordinances. The violence escalated on October 28, 1880. The moon was bright over the chill of Allen Street when a group of cowboys, led by the notorious William Curly Bill Brocious, began shooting at the stars in a drunken display of celebration. The town marshal, Fred White, a brave but older man, ran into the street to disarm them. Wyatt Earp, unarmed but carrying a borrowed pistol in his coat pocket, ran to support him. As White grabbed the barrel of Curly Bill's revolver, the weapon discharged. The slug struck White in the groin, a devastating, agonizing wound. Wyatt did not hesitate. He moved with terrifying speed, wrapping his arm around Curly Bill's neck and slamming the barrel of his own pistol into the rustler's skull. Brocious dropped to the ground, unconscious. Wyatt stood over the fallen outlaw, surrounded by the other cowboys, his face a mask of fury. He dragged Brocious to the jail while White lay bleeding in the dust. Fred White died 2 days later, and although a court ruled the shooting accidental, the die was cast. Wyatt Earp had pistol-whipped a leader of the cowboys. There would be no peace. Following White's death, the political landscape of the region shifted. A new county, Cochise County, was carved out of Pima County in February of 1881. The position of county sheriff was created, a powerful and lucrative role that controlled tax collection and jail fees. Wyatt Earp wanted the job. It was the key to the financial stability and social standing he craved. His rival was Johnny Behan, a politically savvy operator who cozied up to the cowboy element to maintain his power base. Behan and Wyatt met in the back room of a saloon to cut a deal. Behan promised to appoint Wyatt as his undersheriff and split the fees if Wyatt would withdraw his application and support Behan's appointment. Wyatt, believing in the sanctity of a man's word, agreed. Behan was appointed sheriff by the governor. But once the badge was pinned to his vest, Behan reneged on the deal. He appointed another man as undersheriff and cut Wyatt out completely. The betrayal was personal and profound. Wyatt realized that Behan was not just a rival. He was a puppet of the cowboys, a shield behind which they could operate with impunity. The tension simmered through the spring of 1881. In March, a stagecoach carrying silver bullion was attacked near Drew's station. The driver, Bud Philpott, was killed by a shotgun blast to the chest. The horses panicked, and the robbers fled empty-handed. The cowboys immediately spread the rumor that Doc Holliday, Wyatt's tubercular friend who had followed him from Dodge City, was the architect of the robbery. They coerced Holliday's mistress, Big Nose Kate, into signing an affidavit implicating the dentist while she was in a drunken stupor. Wyatt was forced to bail his friend out of jail, furiously working to disprove the charges. The accusation was a clear tactic by the cowboy faction to discredit the Earps by associating them with highway robbery. The legal battle ended with the charges being dismissed due to a lack of evidence. But the reputational damage was done. The town was now split into two hostile camps. The Earp faction, representing federal authority and central order, and the cowboy faction, representing county rule and unrestricted freedom. June 2nd, 1881. The pressure was mounting on all sides. Wyatt entered the Oriental Saloon and found himself in a confrontation with Milt Joyce, a county supervisor and owner of the establishment who was allied with Behan. The argument started over the tax collection but quickly turned violent. Joyce, a large man, insulted Wyatt. Wyatt, his patience eroded by months of political maneuvering and threats, struck Joyce with his pistol. The blow was severe. Joyce's partner tried to intervene and Wyatt struck him as well. It was a rare loss of control for Earp, a sign that the constant siege was wearing down his legendary composure. He was arrested for assault and fined, the humiliation adding fuel to the fire burning inside him. He walked the streets of Tombstone with a grim determination, watching the faces of the men who passed him, checking for the red sashes that marked his enemies. In August of 1881, the patriarch of the rustlers, Old Man Clanton, was ambushed and killed by Mexican assailants in Guadalupe Canyon while moving a herd of stolen cattle. His death removed the last restraining influence on the cowboy gang. The leadership passed to the younger, more volatile generation. Ike Clanton, a boisterous braggart who drank too much and talked too loud, and his brother Billy. They were joined by the McClory brothers and the brooding gunman Johnny Ringo. This new guard lacked the caution of the older rustlers. They wanted a confrontation. They began to openly threaten the Earps in the saloons, boasting that they would run the Kansas pimps out of the territory. September 8th, 1881. The Bisbee stage was robbed. This time the masked men took the strongbox and the passengers' valuables. Wyatt and Virgil, who was now the town marshal, investigated. They found evidence linking the robbery to Frank Stillwell and Pete Spence, two associates of Sheriff Behan. The Earps arrested them, dragging them into town in irons. The arrest was a direct challenge to Behan's authority and a slap in the face to the cowboys. The cowboys viewed the arrest as harassment, a persecution of their friends by federal tyrants. The atmosphere in Tombstone became poisonous. Men stopped speaking to their neighbors. Store owners kept shotguns under their counters. The air crackled with the static of impending violence. By mid-October, the rhetoric had turned murderous. Ike Clanton was the primary agitator. He believed that the Earps had revealed secret information about his involvement in the earlier stage robbery attempts, a breach of confidence that could get him killed by his own associates. Paranoia consumed him. He began to drink heavily, moving from saloon to saloon, telling anyone who would listen that the Earps had to die. He arrived in Tombstone on October 25, 1881, driving a wagon in from the ranch. He stopped at the Alhambra saloon for a lunch of sandwiches and whiskey. The whiskey took hold quickly. That evening, the 25th of October, the fuse was lit. The wind was whipping through the streets, carrying the chill of the coming winter. Doc Holliday, coughing into his handkerchief and smelling of gin, entered the Alhambra. He saw Ike Clanton at the bar. The two men hated each other with a chemical purity. Holliday, fearless because he was already dying, taunted Clanton. He called him a liar and a coward, challenging him to draw his weapon. Clanton, unarmed at that moment or claiming to be, backed down, his face flushing with rage. He shouted that he was not healed but would be ready in the morning. Wyatt Earp was eating dinner in the Occidental saloon nearby when he heard the commotion. He walked into the street, the wind tugging at his long coat. He found the two men arguing, their hands twitching near their holsters. Wyatt separated them, his voice low and hard. He told Clanton to go home and sleep it off. He told Holliday to go to his room. But Ike Clanton did not go home. He stewed in his anger, the alcohol fueling his sense of victimization. He moved to the Occidental, where he continued to drink and play poker. The game was tense. Virgil Earp, the town marshal, sat in on the game, watching Clanton with tired eyes. Clanton played with a Winchester rifle resting against his knee. He told Virgil that as soon as the Earp brothers showed their faces on the street in the morning, the ball would open. He threatened to kill them all. Virgil, exhausted and wanting to avoid a shootout in a crowded room, told him to go to bed. Clanton refused. The game broke up in the early hours of the morning, the men drifting out into the cold darkness. Wyatt walked home to the small house he shared with Maddie on 1st Street. He checked the load in his revolver, a Smith & Wesson break-top he had favored recently. He could hear the wind rattling the window panes. He knew that the talking was over. The diplomacy had failed. The political deals had failed. The arrests had failed. The cowboys were not going to leave, and they were not going to submit. Ike Clanton was prowling the streets, armed and making threats that could not be ignored. The McClory brothers were expected in town the next day. Billy Clanton was coming. The forces were converging on a single point in time. Wyatt lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the path that had brought him here. From the cornfields of Illinois to the jail cell in Arkansas to the brothels of Peoria and the cattle pens of Dodge. Every step had hardened him, stripping away the layers of hesitation until only the survival instinct remained. He was surrounded by enemies. The sheriff was against him. The outlaw element was against him. The town was watching. He knew that tomorrow, October 26th, would not be a day for buffaloing or arrests. It would be a day for killing. He closed his eyes, but sleep was thin and fitful. Outside, in the freezing dark of Allen Street, Ike Clanton was still drinking, waiting for the sun to rise so he could start the war. October 26th, 1881. The dawn broke over the dragoons with a pale, sickly light, illuminating a town that had not slept. The temperature had plummeted overnight, and the wind whipped down Allen Street, carrying sporadic flurries of snow that dusted the backs of the horses tied to the hitching rails. It was a miserable, biting cold that stiffened the fingers and made the metal of a gun burn the skin. Wyatt Earp woke in his small house, the dread of the inevitable settling into his bones like the chill from the floorboards. He knew, with the certainty of a man who had lived by the gun for a decade, that the talking was finished. The previous night's threats from Ike Clanton were not the whiskey-fueled ramblings of a drunkard. They were a declaration of war. Wyatt dressed methodically, putting on a heavy woolen suit to ward off the freezing wind, and checked the action of his Smith & Wesson revolver. He spun the cylinder, the oil smelling sharp and clean, ensuring the hammer moved freely. He dropped the weapon into his coat pocket, keeping his hand on the grip as he stepped out into the gray morning. Down on the street, the situation had already deteriorated. Ike Clanton was moving from saloon to saloon, armed with a Winchester rifle and a revolver, visibly agitated and looking for the Earps. He was telling anyone who would listen that the ball was about to open and that the Earps would be dead before the sun was high. He was hunting. Virgil Earp, the town marshal, had spent the night in a state of exhaustion, trying to manage the poker game and the threats. But he could not ignore an armed man stalking the streets in violation of the city ordinance. Virgil found Ike on 4th Street near the mouth of an alley. He did not ask for a surrender. He approached Ike from behind, grabbed the barrel of the rifle with his left hand, and with his right hand, he drove the barrel of his pistol into the back of Ike's head. The blow was solid and sickening. Ike crumbled, his knees hitting the dirt. Virgil disarmed him, dragging the dazed cowboy to the courtroom of Justice of the Peace A.O. Wallace. While Ike was being processed, Wyatt was walking down Allen Street. He encountered Tom McClory, who had just arrived in town. The tension was electric. Wyatt, his patience eroded by months of insults and the immediate threat to his family, confronted McClory. He asked if McClory was healed. Tom denied it, though his coat hung heavy. Wyatt did not wait for a confession. He stepped in close, his eyes dead and cold, and slapped McClory across the face with his left hand. As McClory reeled, Wyatt drew his revolver and struck him over the head with the barrel. McClory dropped to the boardwalk, blood streaming from a gash in his scalp. Wyatt looked down at the stunned man and told him that if he wanted to fight, he should make a fight of it right there. McClory, dazed and disarmed of his dignity, scrambled away. The physical assaults on 2 members of the cowboy faction within an hour signaled that the Earps were no longer playing defense. They were clearing the board. The courtroom scene was a farce of justice. Ike Clanton, nursing a bleeding head, was fined $25 for carrying a weapon within city limits. He paid the fine, seething with a murderous humiliation. He stood in the courtroom and told Virgil that he would see him later. It was not a goodbye. It was a promise. The cowboys began to congregate. Frank McClory and Billy Clanton rode into town, having breakfasted at the Antelope Springs Ranch. They arrived to find their brothers beaten and disarmed. The dynamic shifted instantly. It was no longer just Ike running his mouth. It was the McClory brothers, dangerous and competent gunmen, and Billy Clanton, a young man eager to prove his mettle. They met at Spangenberg's gun shop on 4th Street. Frank McClory, a proficient shooter, insisted on buying ammunition. He purchased a belt of cartridges, his hands moving with a precise, angry energy. The shop owner saw the intent in their eyes and the way they checked their weapons. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the cowboys had moved to a vacant lot on Fremont Street, a narrow strip of land barely 15 feet wide, sandwiched between Fly's photography studio and the Harwood house. It was a tactical choke point, a defensible position that offered a clear line of sight. Rumors swirled through the town that they were armed and waiting. Sheriff Johnny Bean, trying to assert his authority and perhaps prevent a massacre that would happen on his watch, went to the lot to talk to them. He found them angry and recalcitrant. They refused to leave. Bean, ever the politician, tried to smooth things over, but he was out of his depth. He was a man of words in a moment that demanded iron. At the Hafford's Corner Saloon, the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday gathered. They watched the citizens scurrying off the streets, the shops closing their shutters. The town knew what was coming. Virgil, as the chief of police, made the decision. He could not allow an armed group of men who had threatened his life to occupy a fortified position in the center of town. It was a direct challenge to his authority and the rule of law. If he backed down now, he could never wear the badge again. He turned to his brothers. Wyatt, Morgan, and Virgil were ready. Doc Holliday, wearing a long gray coat that concealed a shotgun Virgil had handed him, fell in beside them. Doc was smiling, a tight, grim expression that showed his teeth. He told them that this was a good day for it. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, the four men stepped onto 4th Street and turned onto Fremont. They walked abreast, a dark wall of coats and hats moving against the wind. They did not hurry. Their pace was deliberate, a funeral march rhythm that echoed off the wooden storefronts. The wind blew dust into their faces, but they did not blink. People watching from the windows saw the grim determination in their posture. They were not going to arrest the cowboys, they were going to confront them. The distance to the vacant lot was short, a few hundred yards of dirt that measured the remaining lifespan of 3 men. Sheriff Bayan saw them coming and ran to intercept them. He held up his hands, his face pale. He told Virgil that he had been down to the lot and that he had disarmed the cowboys. He pleaded with them not to go down there, claiming everything was under control. Virgil looked at the sheriff, his eyes narrowing. He did not believe him. He pushed past Bayan, stating that he was going to disarm them himself. Wyatt brushed by the sheriff without a word, his focus entirely on the sliver of space between the buildings ahead. Bayan's lie, or his incompetence, sealed the fate of the men in the lot. The Earps now believed momentarily that the cowboys might be unarmed, but they kept their hands near their weapons regardless. They arrived at the vacant lot. The space was tight, cluttered with a few horses and the high board fence of the OK Corral at the rear. The cowboys were arranged in a loose line. Frank McClory stood near the street holding his horse's reins. Tom McClory was next to him, his hand resting on a rifle in the scabbard of his saddle. Billy Clanton stood near the Harwood house and Ike Clanton was lurking in the rear. They were waiting. When they saw the Earps, they stiffened. The wind howled through the gap between the buildings, stinging their eyes. Virgil Earp stopped 10 feet from them. He held a cane in his right hand, his pistol still holstered. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying over the wind. He commanded them to throw up their hands, stating he had come to disarm them. The response was immediate and fatal. Frank McClory snarled that he had them now. His hand dropped to the 6-shooter on his hip. Billy Clanton, young and panicked, reached for his weapon. The sound of hammers. Cocking was distinct, a metallic clicking that sounded like dry twigs snapping. Wyatt Earp did not hesitate. He did not reach for the man who was drawing on him. He knew that Billy Clanton was aiming at him, but he assessed that Frank McClory was the more dangerous professional. Wyatt ignored the threat to his own life to neutralize the greatest threat to the group. He drew his Smith & Wesson from his coat pocket. The movement was fluid, practiced 1,000 times in the mirror. Frank fired. Wyatt fired. The 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously, blending into a single deafening roar. Frank's bullet tore through the fabric of Wyatt's coat, missing his skin by inches. Wyatt's bullet struck Frank McClory in the abdomen, just above the belt buckle. Frank doubled over, the wind knocked out of him, gut-shot and dying, his horse bolting in terror. The air instantly filled with the acrid smoke of black powder. The confined space turned into a chaotic killbox. Then Billy Clanton fired at Wyatt but missed, the slug slamming into the wall of Fly's studio. Morgan Earp, standing near his brother, dropped to one knee and fired, his bullet striking Billy in the right wrist, shattering the joint. Billy transferred his gun to his left hand, his face twisted in agony, and continued to fire. Virgil, seeing the escalation, threw his cane aside and drew his revolver. He fired at Billy, hitting him in the chest. Tom McClory, whom Wyatt had beaten earlier, jumped behind a horse, trying to retrieve the rifle from the scabbard. The horse, spooked by the gunfire, spun around, denying him the weapon. Doc Holliday, who had maneuvered to the flank, raised the short double-barreled shotgun from under his coat. He stepped around the horse, closing the distance to less than 10 feet. Tom looked up, his eyes wide with the realization of his death. Doc pulled the trigger. The blast was thunderous. The charge of buckshot struck Tom McClory in the right side under the armpit. The impact lifted him off his feet and threw him into the dirt of Fremont Street. A hole the size of a dinner plate was blown through his ribs, his lungs and liver shredded. He did not move again. Ike Clanton, the man who had started the war, the man who had bragged all night about killing Earps, broke. He saw his brother falling and the McClorys dying. He screamed and ran forward, not to fight but to flee. He grabbed Wyatt's arm, babbling that he was unarmed. Wyatt looked at him with disgust, the battle raging around them. He shoved Ike away, telling him to fight or get out. Ike scrambled past them, diving into the door of Fly's studio, leaving his brother and friends to die in the dirt. Frank McClory, despite the hole in his stomach, was not done. He staggered into the street, using his horse for cover, blood soaking his trousers. He leveled his pistol at the Earps. He saw Doc Holliday discarding the empty shotgun and drawing his nickel-plated revolver. Frank shouted that he had him now. Doc, cool as ice, replied that he was a daisy if he did. Frank fired, the bullet grazing Doc's hip, burning a furrow across his back but hitting the belt holster. Doc fired back, his bullet striking Frank in the chest. Almost simultaneously, Morgan Earp fired a round that struck Frank behind the ear, crashing through his brain. Frank McClory fell face down on the sidewalk, dead before he hit the ground. Billy Clanton was the last man fighting. He was sitting on the ground, his back against the wall of the Harwood house. He had been shot in the wrist and the chest. He was bleeding profusely, his life pumping out onto the frozen earth. He raised his pistol with a shaking left hand, trying to cock the hammer. He fired blindly, the smoke obscuring his vision. One of his bullets found a mark. Virgil Earp jerked as a slug passed through his right calf, tearing the muscle. He stumbled but stayed upright. Another bullet from the chaotic volley struck Morgan Earp, entering one shoulder blade and traversing his back to exit the other, chipping a vertebra. Morgan collapsed, the shock of the spinal impact dropping him instantly. Wyatt Earp stood amidst the carnage, the only man untouched. He stood tall in the swirling smoke, his coat perforated but his body whole. He looked at Billy Clanton. The boy was trying to lift his gun again, whispering for more cartridges. Wyatt watched as the strength left the young man's arm. The pistol clattered to the stones. Billy slumped back, his eyes staring up at the gray sky, his breath coming in wet, bubbling gasps. The shooting stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. It had lasted 30 seconds. In that half-minute, 30 shots had been fired. 3 men lay dead or dying in the street. Frank McClory lay still on the sidewalk. Tom McClory was a ruin of flesh in the gutter. Billy Clanton was gasping his last breaths against the wall. Virgil and Morgan were bleeding, their faces gray, with shock. The smoke hung low in the alley, trapped by the buildings, a sulphurous fog that tasted of death. Sheriff Bean stepped out from where he had been cowering. He looked at the bodies and then at the Earps. He tried to arrest Wyatt, his voice trembling. Wyatt looked at the sheriff with a contempt that could scorch the earth. He told Bean that he would not be arrested today, that he had been deceived, and that the sheriff had claimed the men were unarmed. Wyatt holstered his hot weapon, the metal radiating warmth through his coat. He turned his back on the sheriff and went to tend to his brothers. They loaded Virgil and Morgan into a wagon that appeared from the livery. The pain was setting in now, the adrenaline fading. Morgan, white-faced, whispered that he was hurt bad. Virgil, clutching his leg, grit his teeth. Wyatt walked beside the wagon as it creaked toward the hotel. He looked back at the vacant lot only once. The townspeople were beginning to emerge, swarming the site, like ants. They stared at the bodies of the cowboys, the men who had ruled the territory with fear now reduced to meat in the dust. The legend of the invincible outlaw was shattered. The wind picked up again, blowing the smoke away, but the stain on the ground remained. The OK Corral gunfight was over, but the war had just entered a new, darker phase. Wyatt Earp had survived the 30 seconds in hell. But as he looked at his wounded brothers and the gathering crowd, he knew that the reckoning was far from finished. The blood spilled on Fremont Street was not an end, it was a beginning. The badge had done its work. Now the shadow of revenge began to stretch long across the desert floor. October 27th, 1881. The sun rose over Tombstone, illuminating a town that had been irrevocably fractured by the violence of the previous afternoon. The bodies of Billy Clanton and the McClory brothers lay on slabs in the window of the Ritter and Ream Undertakers, a grim display that drew crowds of morbid spectators. The quiet of the desert was replaced by a dull roar of outrage from the cowboy faction and their sympathizers. The San Francisco Examiner and other papers screamed headlines of the massacre, painting the Earps not as lawmen enforcing order but as cold-blooded executioners who had gunned down citizens in the street. The narrative of the fight was already being twisted, the 30 seconds of chaos reshaped into a tale of martyrdom. A placard was placed over the caskets of the dead men with the inscription, "Murdered in the streets of Tombstone." It was a declaration that the legal justification of the shooting would be contested not just in the courts, but in the blood of the survivors. The funeral for the three cowboys on October 28th was the largest gathering in the history of the territory. Over 2,000 people followed the hearse to the Boot Hill graveyard, a procession of wagons, buggies, and mounted riders that stretched for blocks. The sheer size of the crowd was a physical manifestation of the danger now facing the Earp family. Sheriff Behan rode prominently in the procession, cementing his alliance with the outlaw element. Wyatt Earp watched from a distance, his face a mask of granite. He understood the message. The town was turning against them. The business owners who had once clamored for Earp-style justice were now recoiling from the reality of it. They wanted safe streets, but they did not want the corpses of ranchers piling up on the boardwalks. The legal machinery began to turn immediately. Ike Clanton, the man who had fled the fight, filed murder charges against Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan Earp, as well as Doc Holliday. Sheriff Behan moved to arrest them. Virgil was suspended as town marshal, stripping him of his badge and his official authority. Wyatt and Doc were taken into custody and held in the county jail, a humiliation that burned Wyatt like acid. He sat in the cell, listening to the jeers of the other prisoners, realizing that the system he had served was now trying to consume him. The defense team, led by Thomas Fitch, managed to secure a habeas corpus hearing, getting them released on bail, which was posted by loyal friends like the mining tycoon E.B. Gage. But the freedom was conditional. They faced a preliminary hearing that would decide if they would hang for murder. The hearing began on October 31st, 1881, before Justice of the Peace Wells Spicer. It was a grueling month-long ordeal held in a cramped, stifling courtroom packed with armed men from both factions. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the smell of unwashed bodies. The prosecution, aided by Ike Clanton's perjured testimony, painted a picture of a calculated ambush. Ike swore that the cowboys had surrendered, that his brother and the McClorys had their hands in the air when the Earps opened fire. He wept on the stand, a performance that galvanized the cowboy sympathizers. Witnesses for the prosecution claimed that Tom McClory was unarmed and that the Earps had fired the first shots without warning. It was a barrage of lies designed to send Wyatt and his brothers to the gallows. Wyatt sat at the defense table, his eyes scanning the room, marking the faces of the men who wanted him dead. He did not testify orally, fearing a trap by the prosecutors. Instead, he prepared a written statement, which he read aloud to the court on November 16th. His voice was steady, a deep baritone that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. He detailed the history of the threats, the confrontations, and the terror the cowboys had inflicted on the town. He described the moment at the vacant lot, stating clearly that he believed they were about to be assassinated. He admitted to killing Frank McClory. He did not apologize. He stated that he was an officer of the law performing a duty that the sheriff had failed to do. The reading of the statement was a pivotal moment, a reclamation of the narrative by the man who had lived it. On November 30th, Judge Spicer delivered his ruling. He sat at the bench, a long document in his hands while the town held its breath. Spicer dissected the evidence, noting the conflicting testimonies and the clear intent of the cowboys to provoke violence. He ruled that while the shooting was tragic, the defendants were fully justified in their actions as law enforcement officers confronting an armed and dangerous resistance. He ordered the charges dismissed and the prisoners discharged. The gavel came down like a thunderclap. The Earp faction erupted in relief, but the cowboy faction sat in a stunned silence that quickly curdled into a cold, murderous resolve. The law had failed them. They would now turn to an older, darker form of justice. The victory in court was Pyrrhic. The Earps were free, but they were destitute and hunted. The legal fees had drained their savings. They lost their positions as officers. They were now private citizens in a town swarming with enemies who had sworn a blood oath of vengeance. The threats became specific and constant. Notes were slipped under doors. Rumors were whispered in the dark corners of the saloons. The Earps moved into the Cosmopolitan Hotel for safety, turning the establishment into a fortress. They walked the streets heavily armed, never alone, always watching the rooftops and the alleyways. The winter of 1881 settled over Tombstone, bringing freezing rain and a pervasive sense of doom. The first blow of the counterattack landed on December 28, 1881. The night was pitch black, the moon obscured by heavy storm. Virgil Earp, though no longer marshal, was still a target of immense hatred. He left the Oriental Saloon shortly before midnight, intending to cross 5th Street to his room at the Cosmopolitan. The street was dark, the gas lamps flickering in the wind. As he stepped off the boardwalk, passing a construction site for the new Palace Saloon, the darkness erupted. 3 distinct muzzle flashes lit up the night from behind the unfinished walls. Double-barreled shotguns loaded with buckshot roared from a distance of barely 60 feet. The projectiles tore through the air, seeking the former marshal. One charge missed, peppering the wall of the saloon behind him. The second charge struck Virgil in the back and left arm. The impact was devastating. The heavy slug shattered the humerus bone above the elbow, turning the skeletal structure into splinters. The force of the blow spun him around and dropped him into the mud. He did not scream. He dragged himself to his feet, his left arm hanging by mere tendons and skin, blood pouring from the ruin of his limb. He staggered into the hotel, collapsing in the lobby. Wyatt was in his room when he heard the shots. He ran downstairs, his revolver drawn, expecting a full assault. He found his brother lying in a pool of blood, his face gray with shock. The doctor was summoned immediately. The examination was grim. 5.5 inches of bone had been blasted away. The arm was destroyed. The doctor laid out his instruments, the saw, the scalpel, the probe. He told Virgil that he might have to amputate. Virgil, looking up through a haze of agony, told the doctor to wait, that he could still use the arm to hug his wife. They removed the shattered bone fragments, leaving the arm as a useless appendage of flesh forever crippled. The assassination attempt on Virgil terrified the town. It was a cowardly act, a shot from the dark, violating the code of the face-to-face duel. The cowboys were sending a message. There were no rules anymore. Wyatt stood by his brother's bedside, listening to his labored breathing. The rage that had been simmering since the court hearing boiled over. He realized that the law could not protect them. The judge's ruling meant nothing to men who hid in the shadows with shotguns. He began to organize. He petitioned the U.S. Marshal for deputy appointments, gathering a small, loyal posse of hard men: Sherman McMaster, Texas Jack Vermillion, Turkey Creek Jack Johnson. They were no longer waiting for warrants, they were preparing for war. January and February of 1882 passed in a state of siege. The Earp women, Mattie, Allie, and Bessie, were living in terror. Every sound in the night was a potential assassin. The brothers took turns guarding each other. They wore armor, heavy layers of clothing, or improvised metal plates, though it offered little protection against a rifle slug. The tension was unsustainable. Wyatt tried to sell his gambling interests, desperate for cash to fund their defense and potential flight. But there were no buyers. Who would invest in a dead man's business? The climax of the terror arrived on Saturday, March 18, 1882. The night was damp and cold. Morgan Earp, the youngest and most spirited of the brothers, was restless. He had been cooped up in the hotel for weeks. He wanted to watch a show at the Schieffelin Hall, but Wyatt insisted they stay together. They went to the Campbell and Hatch Saloon and Billiard Parlor on Allen Street. The room was warm, the air thick with cigar smoke and the click of billiard balls. Morgan challenged the owner, Bob Hatch, to a game of pool. Wyatt sat in a chair against the wall watching the game, his eyes moving constantly to the doors and windows. Morgan was in good spirits. He moved around the table, chalking his cue, joking with Hatch. The time was shortly before 11 o'clock. The rear door of the saloon, which had glass panes in the upper half, opened onto a dark alley that ran behind the buildings. The bottom half of the door was painted over, but the top was clear. Someone had rubbed away the paint on the bottom pane to create a peephole, or perhaps used a crack in the wood. Outside, in the pitch-black alley, gunmen were positioning themselves. They used a stacked pile of lumber to stabilize their aim. Morgan leaned over the table to take a shot. His back was to the rear door. He called out to Hatch, "I have a very good hand." Those were the last coherent words of his life. A roar like a cannon blast shattered the glass of the rear door. A .45 caliber slug tore through the pane, whistling across the room. It struck Morgan in the right side of his back. The bullet smashed through his spinal column, shattering the vertebrae, passed through his left side, and exited his body to lodge in the thigh of a bystander named George Barry, who fell to the floor in shock. Morgan collapsed instantly, his legs paralyzed, the sensation cut off as if by a switch. He hit the floor hard. A second shot rang out, striking the wall near Wyatt's head, missing him by inches. Wyatt was on his feet before the glass stopped falling. He drew his revolver and ran toward the back door, but the assassins had already vanished into the darkness of the alley. He returned to his brother. Morgan was lying on the sawdust-covered floor, his face pale, his eyes wide with the realization of what had happened. They carefully lifted him and carried him to a lounge in the card room, then moved him to the doctor's office across the street. The scene in the doctor's office was a tableau of despair. Doctors Goodfellow, Matthews, and Miller worked frantically, but the damage was catastrophic. The spinal cord was severed. There was nothing medicine could do. Morgan was in agony, the pain radiating from the shattered spine while his legs remained dead. He looked at his brothers, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He asked Virgil, who was hobbling on his crutches, to hold him up. He whispered that he could not see them anymore. The light was fading from his eyes. Wyatt knelt beside him, holding his hand, feeling the life drain out of the young man he had sworn to protect. The guilt was a physical weight. He had brought them here. He had dragged them into this feud. Now Virgil was a cripple and Morgan was dying. The anger that had driven him in Dodge City, the cold calculation that had served him at the OK Corral, was replaced by a hollow black void. He listened to Morgan's breathing slow down, the intervals between breaths stretching longer and longer until they ceased. Morgan Earp died at 1:50 in the morning on March 19, 1882. He was 30 years old. The silence in the room was absolute. Wyatt stood up. He looked at the body of his brother. He looked at the doctors who shook their heads. He looked at Virgil, who was leaning against the wall, weeping silently. Something inside Wyatt Earp broke and something else solidified. The lawman was dead. The officer of the court who had read a statement to Judge Spicer was gone. In his place was an instrument of retribution. He walked out of the office into the cold night air of Tombstone. The stars looked down on him with indifferent brilliance. He knew who had done this. The names Frank Stillwell, Pete Spence, Florentino Cruz, and Curly Bill Brocious burned in his mind. They had used the dark to kill his brother because they were afraid to face him in the light. He went back to the hotel to tell the wives. The sounds of their wailing filled the hallway, a chorus of grief that tore at his nerves. He told them to pack. They were leaving. He would send Virgil and the women to California, to the safety of the family home in Colton. He would put Morgan's body on the train with them. But Wyatt Earp was not going to California. Not yet. He checked his weapons, the buntline if he had it, or the standard Colts, and the shotgun. He gathered his posse. Warren Earp, the youngest brother who had arrived late to the tragedy, joined him. Doc Holliday, coughing and racking the slide of a shotgun, stood ready. Sherman McMaster, who knew the cowboy hideouts, was in. They were not going to serve warrants, they were not going to hold hearings, they were going to balance the ledger. The sun rose on March 19th, illuminating a changed world. The legal constraints that had bound Wyatt's hands were severed by the bullet that killed Morgan. He pinned a Deputy U.S. Marshal badge to his coat, but it was a formality, a piece of tin to give his vengeance the color of authority. He went to the telegraph office and sent messages to his allies. He arranged for the transport of the body. He moved with a terrifying efficiency. The grief was there, deep and crushing, but he packed it down, compressing it into fuel for the violence to come. As the afternoon wore on, the Earp party moved Morgan's casket to the train station in Contention City. They loaded it onto the baggage car. Virgil, his arm in a sling, boarded with the women. Wyatt stood on the platform, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew the cowboys were watching. He knew they would try to finish the job, to kill Virgil and perhaps Wyatt himself before they could leave the territory. Intelligence reached him that Frank Stillwell and Ike Clanton were in Tucson. Lying in wait at the train depot there, they were planning another ambush, another shot from the dark. Wyatt's lip curled in a snarl that frightened the station master. Let them wait. He boarded the train, not as a passenger, but as a guard. He sat in the darkness of the car, his shotgun across his knees, watching the desert landscape blur past. The train chugged north toward Tucson, carrying the dead and the maimed. Wyatt Earp sat in the silence, listening to the rhythm of the wheels. Every click of the track sounded like a hammer cocking. The time for judgment was over. The time for blood had arrived. The badge had made him famous, but the next few weeks would carve his name into the bedrock of American history. He closed his eyes and saw Morgan's face, and he whispered a promise to the empty air. He would kill them all. March 20th, 1882. The Southern Pacific train rattled across the dark expanse of the Arizona desert, the iron wheels grinding a monotonous rhythm against the rails that vibrated through the floorboards of the passenger car. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the smell of coal smoke and the nervous perspiration of men who knew they were being hunted. Wyatt Earp sat near the window, staring out into the black void, his reflection ghosting against the glass. He was armed for a war, a 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun resting across his knees, the cold steel barrels a physical anchor in a world that had spun out of control. Opposite him sat his brother Virgil, pale and gaunt, his left arm heavily bandaged and useless, the stump of bone hidden beneath layers of linen. Beside Virgil were his wife Allie and Morgan's widow, waiting to escort the body of their murdered husband and brother-in-law back to California. The coffin containing Morgan Earp rode in the baggage, car ahead, a silent passenger that dictated the grim purpose of the night. Surrounding the Earp family was a phalanx of heavily armed men, a Praetorian guard formed from the hardest elements of the frontier. Warren Earp, the youngest brother, sat with a Winchester rifle, his face set in a mask of grief and fury. Doc Holliday, coughing into a handkerchief that came away spotted with blood, checked the loads in his nickel-plated revolvers, his eyes bright with the fever of tuberculosis and the anticipation of violence. Sherman McMaster, a former cowboy turned Earp loyalist, watched the rear door of the car, his hand never straying far from his holster. Turkey Creek Jack Johnson, a man of few words and lethal capability, watched the front. They were a mobile fortress moving through hostile territory where every shadow could conceal an assassin with a long-range rifle. The train began to slow as it approached the lights of Tucson. The brakes squealed, a high-pitched metallic scream that set Wyatt's teeth on edge. Tucson was the county seat, a larger and more dangerous city than Tombstone, filled with the political enemies of the Earps. Intelligence had reached them before they left Contention City that the cowboys were waiting here. Frank Stillwell, Ike Clanton, and other associates of the Outlaw faction had been spotted at the depot watching the trains. They were expecting Virgil to be vulnerable, a cripple fleeing the territory. They did not expect Wyatt to be guarding him with a shotgun. The locomotive hissed steam as it rolled into the station yard, the massive iron beast coming to a halt alongside the wooden platform. The time was shortly after 7 o'clock in the evening. The yard was a labyrinth of tracks, stationary boxcars and piles of lumber illuminated by the harsh flickering glare of gas lamps and the lanterns of the railway workers. Wyatt stood up, signaling to his men. They moved with a practiced discipline, forming a protective ring around Virgil and the women. They stepped down onto the gravel, the stones crunching loudly under their boots. The air in Tucson was warmer than the high desert of Tombstone, but it carried the same scent of dust and danger. Almost immediately, the threat materialized. As the Earp party moved toward the Porter's Hotel to get dinner while they waited for the connection, they spotted men watching them from the shadows of the depot buildings. Doc Holliday, his eyes sharp despite his illness, nudged Wyatt. He pointed toward a cluster of figures near the tracks. Wyatt saw them. Frank Stillwell, a former deputy sheriff turned stage robber and murderer, was there. So was Ike Clanton. They were armed, carrying shotguns and rifles, lurking in the darkness like wolves circling a wounded animal. They saw the Earp posse and hesitated, realizing that the target was not soft. They faded back into the gloom, disappearing behind the lines of freight cars. Wyatt did not give chase immediately. His primary mission was to ensure Virgil got on the westbound train alive. He shepherded the group into the hotel restaurant near the station. They ate in shifts, some men standing guard at the windows while others shoveled food into their mouths without tasting it. The tension in the room was palpable. The other patrons sensed the violence radiating from the Earp table and gave them a wide berth. Wyatt barely touched his meal. He drank coffee, black and bitter, his mind calculating the geometry of the train yard. He knew Stillwell and Clanton were still out there. They would wait until the train was ready to depart, hoping to catch Virgil as he boarded, firing from the darkness where they could not be seen. At 7:15, the whistle blew, signaling the arrival of the westbound train that would take Virgil to California. The party moved back out to the platform. The darkness had deepened. The yard was a chaotic mix of shadows and blinding lights from the locomotive headlamps. Wyatt scanned the perimeter. He saw movement near a flat car loaded with gravel. The shapes of men were moving parallel to the train, trying to get into position for a clear shot at the passenger cars. Wyatt whispered to Virgil to get on board and stay low. He embraced his brother quickly, a rough hug that acknowledged they might never see each other again. Virgil climbed the steps, assisted by the women. Once Virgil was safe inside the steel skin of the train car, the dynamic changed. Wyatt was no longer a bodyguard. He was a hunter. He signaled to Doc, McMaster, and Johnson. They did not board the train. Instead, they slipped into the shadows between the cars, moving silently on the ballast. Wyatt took the 10-gauge shotgun and broke it open, checking the brass shells loaded with heavy buckshot. He snapped it closed with a solid click. He began to stalk the men who were stalking his brother. He moved down the length of the train, using the noise of the engine's steam release to mask his footsteps. He saw two figures moving along the parallel track, crouching low, their weapons ready. It was Frank Stillwell and Ike Clanton. They were focused on the windows of the passenger car, waiting for a silhouette to target. They did not look behind them. Wyatt closed the distance, his long legs eating up the ground with terrifying speed. He was not looking to arrest them. He was not looking to read them their rights. He was looking to end them. Stillwell heard something. A boot scraping on a rail, or perhaps the intake of breath. He turned. He saw Wyatt Earp emerging from the steam and smoke, a dark, avenging angel with a shotgun leveled at his chest. Stillwell's eyes went wide. He froze for a fraction of a second, the realization of his error crashing down on him. He was not the hunter. He was the prey. Ike Clanton, seeing Wyatt, did exactly what he had done at the OK Corral. He turned and ran. He dropped his weapon or simply abandoned the fight, sprinting away into the labyrinth of the rail yard, his courage evaporating in the face of the Earp wrath. Frank Stillwell was left alone. He tried to run, scrambling down the tracks, his boots slipping on the loose gravel. Wyatt pursued him. The distance closed rapidly. Stillwell realized he could not outrun the long-legged Lawman. He stopped and turned, raising his weapon, perhaps to surrender or perhaps to fire. It did not matter. Wyatt was less than 20 yards away. He did not speak. He did not ask for a surrender. He pulled the front trigger of the 10-gauge. The shotgun roared, a sound that split the night and drowned out the hiss of the locomotive. The heavy charge of buckshot struck Stillwell in the midsection. The impact was catastrophic. The slugs tore through his clothing and flesh, shredding his internal organs and knocking him backward onto the ties. Stillwell screamed, a guttural sound of agony that was cut short as he hit the ground. But Wyatt was not finished. The rage that had been born in the doctor's office with Morgan was flowing freely now. He racked the shotgun or dropped it. Accounts would blur in the chaos, and drew his revolver. He walked up to the writhing man. Stillwell was trying to crawl, his hands clawing at the sharp stones, blood pooling beneath him. Wyatt stood over him. He fired. The bullet struck Stillwell in the upper body. Wyatt cocked the hammer and fired again, and again. Doc Holliday and the others arrived seconds later. They joined in the execution. The gunfire was rapid and intense, a fusillade that echoed off the metal sides of the boxcars. Stillwell was hit repeatedly. Bullets struck his arms, his legs, and his chest. One slug passed through his left leg, another shattered his right arm. A charge of buckshot had filled his liver with metal. Finally, Wyatt stepped in close, the barrel of his weapon hot to the touch. He aimed at Stillwell's head. The man was already dead or dying, his body a ruin, but the message had to be clear. Wyatt fired one last time at point-blank range. The muzzle flash illuminated the gruesome scene for a split second. The blood, the torn clothes, the terror frozen on Stillwell's face. Then darkness returned. Frank Stillwell lay still on the cinders, his body riddled with 6 loads of buckshot and 4 rifle or pistol balls. He was decimated. Wyatt stood over the corpse, his chest heaving. The smoke from the guns drifted around him, mixing with the coal smoke of the train. He looked down at the man who had undoubtedly been part of the assassination team that killed Morgan. There was no remorse in Wyatt's heart, only a cold, grim satisfaction. The scales had been balanced, at least partially. This was the first blood of the vendetta. It was not a law enforcement action. It was a vigilantism, pure and simple. By killing Stillwell in the Tucson train yard, Wyatt had crossed the Rubicon. He was no longer a deputy marshal enforcing the peace. He was a killer enforcing his own code. The whistle of the westbound train blew again, a long, mournful blast. The wheels began to turn, the heavy steel linkages clanking as the train gathered momentum. Wyatt watched as the cars slid past. He saw Virgil's face in the window for a fleeting moment, white and strained. Then the train was gone, its red taillights fading into the western darkness, carrying the surviving Earps away from the war zone. Wyatt was left standing in the yard with his posse and a corpse. The sound of the gunfire had alerted the entire station. Railway workers and passengers were shouting, pointing toward the tracks. Sheriff Bob Paul, who was traveling on the train but had been unable to intervene in time, would soon telegraph back to Tucson with the details. The Tucson authorities would find the body, warrants would be issued. Wyatt Earp was now a wanted man in Pima County for the murder of Frank Stillwell. The tables had turned completely. The hunter was now the hunted by the official law, even as he hunted the outlaws. Wyatt holstered his revolver and picked up his shotgun. He looked at Doc, Warren, McMaster, and Johnson. They were all breathing hard, the adrenaline coursing through them. There were no words spoken. They knew what they had done. They had committed a capital crime in front of witnesses. There was no going back to a courtroom or a badge. Their only safety now lay in their weapons and their speed. They moved quickly away from the body, leaving Stillwell where he lay for the coroner to find. They melted back into the shadows of the rail yard, moving toward the freight depot where they had left their gear. They had to get back to Tombstone, but not to surrender. They had to retrieve their horses and supplies. The killing of Stillwell was not the end. It was the signal fire. There were other names on the list: Pete Spence, Florentino Cruz, Curly Bill Brocious, Ike Clanton, who had escaped again. They walked along the tracks, the gravel shifting under their feet. Wyatt felt a strange clarity. For months he had been reacting to threats, to court hearings, to ambushes. Now he was acting. He was the one pulling the trigger. He was the one instilling terror. He realized that the law he had served for so long was inadequate for the reality of the frontier. It was too slow, too corruptible, too soft. Justice, true justice, was a heavy piece of soft metal moving at 1,000 feet per second. They reached the end of the line of cars and slipped out of the station proper, heading for the outskirts of town where they could assess their next move. The night was vast and indifferent. The stars shone down with the same cold light that had illuminated the OK Corral and the dark alley behind the billiard parlor. Wyatt looked up at them and felt nothing but a cold resolve. He was done with being a victim. As they walked, the telegraph wires above them were already humming with the news. Frank Stillwell killed at Tucson, Wyatt Earp suspected. The news would reach Tombstone before they did. Bean would be organizing a posse. The cowboys would be riding. The desert was about to become a killing floor. Wyatt adjusted the weight of the shotgun on his shoulder. He was tired, bone-weary from grief and sleeplessness. But his mind was sharp. He was 34 years old, a widower, a brother to a corpse and a cripple, and now a murderer. But he was also free. Free from the constraints of procedure, free to finish what had been started. They found a place to rest briefly in the brush outside the town limits, waiting for a freight train that they could hop back toward the dragoons. Wyatt sat on a rock, reloading his weapons. He pushed the fresh shells into the chambers of the shotgun, the brass gleaming in the moonlight. He thought about Morgan's last words. "I can't see you anymore." Wyatt snapped the breech closed. He would make sure that the men who killed his brother would see him. They would see him coming, and it would be the last thing they ever saw. The Tucson train yard fell silent behind them, save for the shunting of cars. The body of Frank Stillwell lay cooling on the stones, a testament to the new reality. The legend of Wyatt Earp was no longer about a fair fight in a dusty lot. It was about a relentless, merciless vengeance that would pursue its targets to the ends of the earth. The badge was gone. The vendetta had begun. March 21st, 1882. The desert wind carried the dust of the Tucson rail yard away from the Earp party as they rode back toward the town of Tombstone. Wyatt Earp sat in the saddle with a posture of rigid exhaustion, his eyes scanning the horizon for the glint of a rifle barrel. He was now a fugitive in the eyes of the local law, a man who had publicly executed Frank Stillwell in the shadow of a train station. The legal veneer that had protected him during the hearings of the previous year was gone. He was operating on a federal warrant issued for the arrest of the men who had murdered his brother Morgan, but to the sheriff of Cochise County, he was simply a murderer who needed to be hanged. The group riding with him, Sherman McMaster, Turkey Creek Jack Johnson, Texas Jack Vermillion, Doc Holliday, and his younger brother Warren Earp, were no longer a posse in the traditional sense. They were a death squad. They moved through the scrub brush and the rocky arroyos, with the silence of Apache scouts, avoiding the main roads, their intent focused solely on the list of names Wyatt carried in his head. They arrived in Tombstone shortly after noon on the 21st. The town was tense, the news of the Stillwell killing having arrived via telegraph hours before the riders. Wyatt did not hide. He rode boldly into town, dismounting at the Cosmopolitan Hotel. He walked into the lobby, his spurs chiming on the floorboards, his shotgun in the crook of his arm. The citizens gave him a wide berth. They saw the change in him. The cold, professional detachment of the Dodge City Marshal was replaced by a feral intensity. He was not there to police the town. He was there to resupply. He gathered his gear, secured fresh horses, and met with his supporters who provided money and ammunition. The transaction was swift and businesslike. He was preparing for a campaign in the wilderness, a hunt that would take them into the heart of the cowboy strongholds. Sheriff Johnny Bean, hearing of Wyatt's return, approached the Earp party as they were preparing to leave the hotel. Bean was accompanied by a few deputies, but his demeanor was hesitant. He saw the heavily armed men surrounding Wyatt, men who had nothing left to lose. Bean called out to Wyatt, stating that he wanted to see him. Wyatt did not stop adjusting his saddle cinch. He looked over his shoulder at the sheriff, his eyes narrowing in contempt. He told Behan that he had seen him once too often already. With a dismissal that stung worse than a slap, Wyatt mounted his horse. He told his men to ride. They swept out of Tombstone, a column of dust rising behind them, leaving the sheriff standing impotent in the street. They headed for the Dragoon Mountains. The target was Pete Spence. Spence was an associate of the McClorys and Clantons, a man implicated in the stage robberies and the assassination plots. Intelligence suggested he was operating a woodcutting camp in the South Pass of the Dragoons. The posse rode hard, pushing their mounts up the steep, rocky trails. The terrain was unforgiving, a landscape of jagged granite spires and dense manzanita thickets that could hide an army. Wyatt rode at the front, his focus absolute. He did not speak of Morgan or Virgil. He spoke only of the trail and the location of the water holes. The grief was a fuel that burned clean and hot, driving him forward when his body screamed for rest. On the morning of March 22nd, 1882, they located the wood camp. It was a primitive setup, a few canvas tents and a corral tucked into a canyon. They approached with weapons drawn, fanning out to encircle the site. They did not find Pete Spence. Spence, sensing the wind or perhaps warned by a scout, had surrendered himself to the authorities in Tombstone earlier that day, preferring the safety of a jail cell to the justice of Wyatt Earp. However, the camp was not empty. A man named Florentino Cruz, known locally as Indian Charlie, was working there. Cruz had been identified as one of the lookouts during the murder of Morgan Earp. The posse descended on the camp. Cruz saw them coming and tried to run, scrambling up the rocky slope of the canyon wall. It was a futile effort. The Earp party, mounted and armed with Winchesters, cut off his escape. Sherman McMaster fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt near Cruz's feet. Cruz froze, raising his hands. He was dragged back down to the camp, trembling violently. Wyatt dismounted and walked up to him. He did not shout. He asked Cruz simply if he was present when Morgan was killed. The interrogation was brief. Cruz, terrified by the grim circle of men, admitted to holding the horses in the alley while the others fired the fatal shots. He named the shooters. He confirmed what Wyatt already knew. The confession did not buy mercy. It confirmed the sentence. Wyatt looked at the man who had facilitated the murder of his brother. There was no judge to consult, no jury to deliberate. Wyatt told Cruz to make his peace. The posse leveled their weapons. Cruz began to plead, his voice cracking, but the roar of gunfire cut him off. Wyatt and the others fired almost simultaneously. Multiple slugs struck Cruz in the chest and abdomen. The force of the impact knocked him backward into the dust. He was riddled with bullets, dead before the echoes of the shots faded from the canyon walls. They left him where he fell, a message to the rest of the gang that no role in the conspiracy was too small to punish. The killing of Cruz was the second strike. The posse remounted and rode out of the Dragoons, heading west toward the Whetstone Mountains. They were hunting the leadership now. They sought Curly Bill Brocious, the man who had taken command of the Cowboys after the death of Old Man Clanton. Brocious was a dangerous, unpredictable gunman, a man who laughed at the law and killed for sport. Wyatt knew that as long as Brocious lived, the threat remained. They rode through the heat of the day, the sun beating down on their shoulders, the water in their canteens growing warm and stale. The horses were tiring, their coats caked with salt and dust. On March 24, 1882, the Earp posse approached a watering hole known as Iron Springs, located in a deep wash on the edge of the Whetstones. The springs were a vital oasis in the arid landscape, a place where travelers and outlaws alike stopped to refresh their mounts. The approach to the springs was through a sandy arroyo lined with cottonwood trees and heavy brush. Wyatt rode in the Vengeance, his 10-gauge shotgun resting across the pommel of his saddle. His coat was unbuttoned, exposing the cartridge belt at his waist. He was tired, his eyes gritty with lack of sleep, but his instincts were sharp. As they came around a bend in the wash, less than 30 yards from the water, they stumbled directly into the main body of the cowboy gang. Curly Bill Brocious was there along with 8 other men, including Pony Deal and Johnny Barnes. They were dismounted, cooking a meal over a small fire, their horses tied to the brush. The surprise was absolute for both parties. The cowboys scrambled for their weapons, dropping plates and cups. Wyatt's posse, realizing they were outnumbered and exposed in the open ground, reacted with panic. The cowboys opened fire immediately. A volley of rifle slugs tore through the air, snapping branches and kicking up geysers of sand. The horses of the Earp posse, spooked by the sudden noise and the scent of the enemy, bolted. Sherman McMaster, Jack Johnson, and Doc Holliday were forced to retreat, their mounts spinning and bucking, carrying them back toward the cover of the canyon walls. Warren Earp and Texas Jack Vermillion were also driven back. In the chaos of the initial exchange, the posse disintegrated, leaving one man sitting alone in the kill zone. Wyatt Earp did not retreat. His horse halted, confused but not bolting. Wyatt sat exposed in the center of the wash, a stationary target for 9 gunmen. The air around him filled with the buzz of bees, the sound of heavy-caliber bullets passing inches from his head. He felt a tug on his coat as a slug punched through the fabric. Another bullet struck the pommel of his saddle, sending splinters of wood into his thigh. He calmly dismounted, sliding from the saddle with the shotgun in his hand. He did not run for cover. He walked forward. Curly Bill Brocious, seeing Wyatt standing alone, believed the fight was won. He stepped out from the cover of the cottonwoods, a shotgun in his own hands. He was a large man, confident in his lethality. He raised his weapon, leveling it at Wyatt. He shouted something, a taunt or a curse, but the words were lost in the roar of the fight. Wyatt saw him. He saw the face of the man who had tormented the territory, the face of the anarchy he had fought against. Wyatt raised the 10-gauge. The distance was close, perhaps 50 feet. It was a duel of shotguns, a contest that would be decided in a fraction of a second. Curly Bill fired. The buckshot whistled past Wyatt, spreading too wide or aimed too high in the haste of the moment. Wyatt did not miss. He pulled both triggers. The double-barreled shotgun erupted with a deafening boom, unleashing a massive charge of buckshot. The 18 heavy pellets struck Curly Bill in the chest and stomach. The impact was horrific. The outlaw was nearly cut in half by the sheer mass of the metal. He was lifted off his feet and thrown backward into the water of the spring, his blood turning the pool instantly crimson. He did not scream. He simply ceased to exist as a combatant. The death of their leader did not stop the cowboys. They concentrated their fire on Wyatt. Johnny Barnes, hiding behind a tree, fired rapidly. A bullet struck the heel of Wyatt's boot, ripping the leather away and numbing his foot. Another slug passed through the brim of his hat. Wyatt dropped the empty shotgun and drew his long-barreled Colt revolver. He stood his ground, the only upright figure in the wash, firing back with a deliberate, rhythmic cadence. He aimed at the muzzle flashes in the brush. He saw Johnny Barnes exposing himself to take a shot. Wyatt fired. The bullet struck Barnes in the chest. Barnes collapsed, coughing blood, mortally wounded. The other cowboys, shaken by the death of Brocious and the supernatural luck of the lone lawman, began to waver. They stayed behind cover, firing blindly. Wyatt, realizing his shotgun was empty and his position was untenable, began to back away toward his horse. The animal was skittish, dancing away from him as bullets kicked up sand around its hooves. Wyatt grabbed the reins, trying to mount. The leather horn of his saddle had been shot away. His coat hung in tatters. He struggled to pull himself up, his boot slipping in the stirrup due to the missing heel. He finally swung his leg over the saddle, spurring the horse. As he turned to ride out, he fired one last shot over his shoulder. He rode back to where his posse had taken cover. They looked at him with wide eyes, expecting him to be riddled with holes. He was covered in dust, his clothes shredded, but he was untouched. They checked him for wounds. There was no blood on his skin. The legend of Wyatt Earp's invincibility was forged in that wash. He had stood against 9 men, killed their leader, and walked away without a scratch. The posse regrouped. They were low on ammunition and water, and the horses were blown. They could not pursue the remaining cowboys into the rocks. They turned and rode north, leaving the body of Curly Bill Brocious floating in the spring. The news of the fight at Iron Springs spread like wildfire. The cowboys were demoralized. Their leader was dead, killed in a face-to-face duel with the man they had tried to assassinate. The balance of power in the territory shifted irrevocably. The hunters were now the terrified. But the danger was far from over. Sheriff Bean had organized a massive posse numbering nearly 30 men, composed largely of cowboys and their sympathizers. They were tracking the Earp party, intent on killing them under the guise of arrest. The sheriff's posse included men like Johnny Ringo and Ike Clanton. It was a roaming army sweeping the county. Wyatt knew he could not fight a pitched battle against 30 men. He had to outmaneuver them. For the next 2 weeks, the Earp posse engaged in a high-stakes game of cat and mouse across the Dragoon and Chiricahua Mountains. They rode through the harshest terrain in Arizona, relying on their knowledge of the land and the support of friendly ranchers. They stopped at Henry Hooker's Sierra Bonita Ranch, a fortress of a hacienda in the Sulphur Springs Valley. Hooker, a cattle baron who despised the rustlers, gave them sanctuary, fresh horses, and food. When Behan's posse arrived at the ranch demanding the Earps, Hooker confronted the sheriff. He told Behan that he knew where the Earps were but would not give them up to a mob of outlaws wearing badges. He challenged Behan to ride in and get them. Behan, looking at the fortified ranch house and knowing the reputation of the men inside, declined. He rode away, defeated by the moral authority of the rancher and the lethal reputation of his quarry. The physical toll on Wyatt and his men was immense. They slept in their saddles or on the frozen ground, wrapped in single blankets. They ate cold beans and dried meat. Their bodies were pushed to the limit of endurance. Doc Holliday's tuberculosis was worsening under the strain, his coughing fits echoing in the canyons at night. But Wyatt remained implacable. He led them through the mountains, always moving, always watching. He knew that their time in Arizona was coming to an end. The federal warrants were still active, but the political pressure was mounting. They could not stay in the territory indefinitely without being cornered by the sheer numbers of their enemies. By mid-April, Wyatt made the decision to leave. They had accomplished what they set out to do. Frank Stillwell was dead. Florentino Cruz was dead. Curly Bill Brocious was dead. Johnny Barnes was dying of his wounds. The leadership of the cowboy gang was decapitated. The vendetta had been a surgical strike that bled the organization dry. Wyatt gathered his men. They rode east, toward the New Mexico border. They crossed the line near Silver City, leaving the jurisdiction of Sheriff Behan and the Arizona courts behind. The ride out of Arizona was a somber procession. They were leaving behind the graves of Morgan and the shattered life of Virgil. They were leaving behind the town they had tried to tame. Wyatt looked back at the purple mountains of the territory one last time. He felt no regret for the violence he had inflicted. He felt only a cold satisfaction that he had delivered justice where the law had failed. He had turned the main street into a war zone, and then he had turned the wilderness into a graveyard. Upon reaching Silver City, they sold their horses. The animals were worn down, their ribs showing through their hides. Wyatt patted the neck of the horse that had carried him through the fire at Iron Springs. He took the saddlebags containing his few possessions and his weapons. They boarded a train for Colorado, heading for the cooler air and the safety of a state where the governor would likely refuse extradition requests from the corrupt authorities in Arizona. The Vendetta Ride was over. It had lasted less than a month, but it had dismantled the cowboy criminal empire. The men who had ridden with Wyatt dispersed, drifting into history or anonymity. Wyatt Earp sat on the train watching the landscape change from desert cactus to pine trees. He was 34 years old and he was leaving his life as a lawman behind forever. He had entered the territory as a man seeking fortune. He was leaving it as a legend carved from blood and grief. The badge he had worn was just a piece of metal. The gun he carried was the only truth that held any weight on the frontier. He closed his eyes, the rhythm of the train lulling him into a fitful sleep, where the faces of the dead waited for him in the dark. The year 1882 marked the beginning of the slow, grinding erosion of the gunman into the ghost. Wyatt Earp had survived the vendetta in Arizona, emerging from the desert with his life but without a destination. He drifted first to Colorado, settling briefly in Gunnison and then Denver, where he lived under the protection of Governor Frederick Pitkin. The Arizona authorities demanded his extradition, waiving warrants for the murder of Frank Stillwell, but Pitkin refused to sign the papers. The political shield held. Wyatt was safe from the hangman, but he was cast adrift in a West that was rapidly closing its frontiers. The open range was being fenced, the railroad tracks were stitching the continent together, and the need for men who solved problems with a 10-gauge shotgun was diminishing. He was 35 years old, a man with a notorious name and empty pockets, forced to navigate a world that was trading the rule of the gun for the rule of the contract. In May of 1883, a ghost from the past called him back to the plains. Luke Short, a gambler and friend from the Dodge City days, sent a desperate telegram. Short was being run out of Dodge by a rival political faction that wanted to seize his assets. Wyatt did not hesitate. He gathered a crew of formidable gunmen, including Bat Masterson, and boarded a train for Kansas. This was the Dodge City War, but it was a conflict fought with presence rather than ammunition. Wyatt arrived in Dodge not as a marshal, but as a private enforcer. He walked the streets he had once policed, his reputation serving as a weapon more potent than the revolver on his hip. The opposing faction, seeing Earp and his associates, capitulated without a single shot being fired. They reinstated Short, and the victory was commemorated not with a pile of bodies but with a photograph. The Dodge City Peace Commission posed for a portrait, Wyatt, Masterson, Short, and others sitting in suits looking like a board of directors for a violent corporation. It was the last time Wyatt would stand as a kingmaker on the Kansas plains. Following the affair in Dodge, Wyatt turned his eyes toward the Pacific. The boomtowns of the interior were fading, but California was rising. He arrived in San Diego in 1887, just as the city was exploding with the real estate and railroad frenzies. For the first time in years, Wyatt found himself on the right side of the money. He did not wear a badge. He invested. He opened gambling halls, most notably the Oyster Bar on Fifth Avenue. He speculated on land. He bought racehorses. The man who had slept in the dirt of the Dragoon Mountains now wore tailored suits and diamond stickpins. He presided over faro banks where thousands of dollars changed hands nightly. He became a fixture of the sporting set, a man known for his cold nerve and his ability to manage the volatile ecosystem of the gambling hall. During these years, his domestic life stabilized, though it remained unconventional. He had separated from Mattie Blaylock, the woman who had waited for him during the vendetta. She had drifted into despair and eventually suicide in Arizona, an overdose of laudanum claiming her in a dusty mining camp. Wyatt was now with Josephine Marcus, the woman who had sparked so much jealousy in Tombstone. They lived as husband and wife, though no marriage license was ever recorded. They moved through the hotels and boarding houses of the West, a childless couple bound by a shared history and a restlessness that never fully abated. Wyatt doted on her, insulating her from the darker truths of his past, trying to construct a life of respectability on a foundation of bloodshed. The stability of San Diego eventually collapsed with the real estate market in 1889. The money vanished as quickly as it had arrived. Wyatt and Josie moved north to San Francisco, the great metropolis of the coast. Here, Wyatt entered the world of professional horse racing, campaigning a stable of animals on the Bay Area tracks. He was a familiar face at the paddocks, a tall, imposing figure with a drooping mustache and eyes that missed nothing. But the reputation of the gunman followed him, a shadow that he could not outrun. In the salons of San Francisco, he was not just a horse owner. He was the man who had killed at the OK Corral. This notoriety was a double-edged sword, opening doors while simultaneously ensuring that every dispute he settled was viewed through the lens of his violent history. In December of 1896, Wyatt's attempt to reinvent himself as a sportsman ended in a catastrophe that rivaled the Tombstone feud in its impact on his name. He was selected to referee the heavyweight boxing championship between Bob Fitzsimmons and Tom Sharkey at the Mechanics Pavilion in San Francisco. The fight was a massive event, drawing 15,000 spectators in heavy betting action. Fitzsimmons, a lanky Cornishman, was the favorite. Sharkey, a brawling sailor, was the underdog. Wyatt entered the ring carrying a concealed revolver, a violation of the rules that was spotted and forced him to be disarmed by the police captain in front of the jeering crowd. It was a humiliation that set the tone for the night. The fight lasted 8 rounds. Fitzsimmons dominated, battering Sharkey around the ring. In the 8th, Fitzsimmons landed a brutal uppercut to the body that dropped Sharkey to the canvas. Sharkey clutched his groin, writhing in theatrical agony, claiming a foul. Wyatt, standing over the fallen fighter, made a split-second decision. He ruled that the blow had been low. He disqualified Fitzsimmons and awarded the victory and the $15,000 purse to Sharkey. The arena erupted in fury. The crowd believed the fight was fixed. They accused Wyatt of being in on the swindle. The newspapers destroyed him. The San Francisco Call and other dailies painted him as a crook, a con man, and a villain. The legend of the Lawman was buried under allegations of corruption. Wyatt defended his call to his dying day, insisting he saw the foul, but the court of public opinion had already hanged him. Disgraced in San Francisco and broke once again, Wyatt looked north. In 1897, the news of gold in the Yukon Territory triggered a stampede. Wyatt and Josie joined the rush, but they did not go to dig. They went to mine the miners. They traveled to Alaska, eventually settling in Nome during the rush of 1899. Nome was a frozen hellhole on the edge of the Bering Sea, a place of mud, canvas, and desperation that resembled Dodge City on ice. Wyatt opened the Dexter Saloon, a massive 2-story structure that became the hub of the town's social life. He sold liquor at inflated prices to men who had washed gold from the beach sands. The environment in Nome was brutal. The winters were long and dark, the temperature dropping to 30 degrees below zero. Wyatt, who hated the cold, endured it for the money. He policed his own establishment, tossing out drunks and breaking up fights with the same efficiency he had used in Kansas. He was in his 50s now, his hair turning white, but his physical strength was undiminished. He was arrested a few times for minor offenses, interfering with an officer, brawling. But he remained a dominant figure in the chaos of the gold camp. He made a fortune in Nome, reportedly leaving with $80,000, a sum that should have secured his retirement. But the money slipped away again. Wyatt and Josie left Alaska in 1901, returning to the lower 48. They drifted through the mining camps of Tonopah and Goldfield in Nevada, chasing the next boom, always arriving just as the best opportunities were vanishing. Wyatt's gambling habits and bad investments eroded their wealth. He spent his days prospecting in the Mojave Desert, staking claims near Vidal, California. He named his own mine the Happy Days, a bitterly optimistic title for a hole in the ground that yielded copper and gold in amounts that barely covered the cost of extraction. The desert years were a time of solitude and heat. Wyatt spent long winters in a small cottage in Vidal, working the claims, looking for the mother lode that would finally allow him to rest. He was an old man now, his skin weathered like old leather, his hands gnarled from decades of gripping reins and gun stocks. He drove a Model T Ford across the desert tracks, a mechanical replacement for the horse, navigating the washboard roads with a shotgun propped against the seat. He was a relic of the 19th century trying to function in the 20th. The world was moving on. The automobile, the telephone, and the airplane were redefining reality, rendering the skills of the frontier scout obsolete. In the 1910s and 20s, Wyatt and Josie settled in Los Angeles. They lived in a series of rented bungalows, surviving on the modest income from the mines and the charity of family. Los Angeles was becoming the capital of the film industry, and Wyatt found himself drawn to the studios. He was a curiosity to the new generation of actors and directors. He visited the sets of Western movies, watching men in makeup pretend to be the kind of men he had killed. He met Tom Mix and William S. Hart, the cowboy stars of the silent era. They treated him with awe, recognizing the authenticity in his stillness. Wyatt tried to capitalize on his history. He wanted to tell his story, to correct the lies that had been printed in the newspapers for 40 years. He hired a friend, John Flood, to write his biography. Flood was a loyal man but a terrible writer. Wyatt dictated his memories to Flood, recounting the events of Wichita, Dodge, and Tombstone. He emphasized his role as a peace officer, downplaying the darker aspects of the vendetta and the gambling. He wanted to be remembered as a hero, not a killer. But the manuscript Flood produced was dry, stilted, and unpublishable. Publishers rejected it repeatedly. Wyatt was frustrated, unable to shape his own legacy, watching as dime novels continued to print sensationalized fiction about his life. One afternoon on a studio lot, Wyatt met a young prop boy, an aspiring director named John Ford. They sat and talked about the Old West. Wyatt described the Corral fight in detail, drawing diagrams in the dirt, explaining the ballistics and the positioning. Ford listened, absorbing the information that he would later use to mythologize the event in film. It was a strange communion, the actual participant handing the baton to the architect of the legend. Wyatt told Ford that the fight was not a glorious duel but a chaotic, close-range execution. Ford nodded, printing the legend in his mind while the reality sat before him in a worn suit. By 1928, Wyatt's health began to fail. He was 80 years old. The prostate condition that had plagued him for years worsened, causing chronic cystitis. The infection spread to his kidneys. He was in constant pain, his body betraying him after 8 decades of survival. He was confined to his small rented home on West 17th Street in Los Angeles. Josie nursed him, though her own mental state was deteriorating into paranoia and obsession. She protected him fiercely, keeping visitors away, hiding the extent of their poverty. In January of 1929, Wyatt sank into a coma. The infection had overwhelmed his system. He lay in the bed, his breathing shallow. The man who had faced down Claybank stallions, lynch mobs, and professional assassins was being taken by a microscopic bacteria. There were no gunshots, no thunder of hooves, no dramatic final words. There was only the smell of medicine and the sound of the city traffic outside the window. On the morning of January 13, 1929, Wyatt Earp stopped breathing. He passed away quietly, ending a life that had spanned the transition from the ox cart to the airplane. The funeral was held at the Congregational Church on Wilshire Boulevard. It was not the funeral of a famous statesman, but of a man who had outlived his era. The pallbearers included his old friends from the frontier and the new friends from Hollywood. Tom Mix, the movie star, was there, openly weeping as he helped carry the casket. William S. Hart served as a pallbearer as well. They buried him not in the ground, but in fire. Wyatt was cremated, his ashes buried in the Jewish cemetery in Colma, California, alongside the family of his wife, Josie. The marker was simple, giving no hint of the violence that had defined his existence. At the time of his death, Wyatt Earp was largely a forgotten figure to the general public, a footnote in the history of the taming of the West. The Los Angeles Times obituary was respectful but brief. The manuscript he had dictated to Flood lay in a drawer, unpublished. It seemed that he would fade into obscurity, just another old lawman who had died in bed. But the silence was temporary. 2 years after his death, Stuart Lake would publish Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, a highly fictionalized biography that would ignite the modern legend. Wyatt never saw the book that would make him immortal. He never saw the movies that would turn him into the paragon of American justice. He died believing he had failed to clear his name, He died thinking of the cold wind in the Dragoon Mountains, the weight of the buntline in his hand, and the faces of the brothers he had lost. The long fade was complete. The man was gone, reduced to ash and memory. But in the vacuum left by his departure, the myth began to take root, growing wild and uncontrollable, destined to overshadow the grim, literal reality of the life he had actually lived.